Welcome back to another story on Vision Harry. This time, we're bringing you, what if Gringotts' inheritance scan at age 6 revealed Dumbledore stole 12 million galleons and 8 lordships from Harry. Your likes fuel our creativity. Subscribe and stay tuned. Here's the story. Chapter 1, The ledger. The cake had 3 candles on it when Aunt Petunia realized she'd bought the wrong number, and rather than go back to the shop she'd simply pulled one out and dropped it in the bin. So Harry Potter turned 6 with 2 candles and a slice of Victoria sponge smaller than his fist, sitting at the corner of the kitchen table while Dudley had the whole end to himself and blew crumbs across the tablecloth with every bite. Harry didn't mind the cake, really. He'd learned early that minding things at the Dursleys was a waste of energy. You minded things, they got worse, and then you had less energy for the things that actually mattered, like staying out of Dudley's reach and remembering which floorboard creaked outside the cupboard so you could hear Vernon coming. What Harry minded, in the quiet space behind his eyes where he kept everything important, was the letter. It had arrived 3 days ago, slipped through the mail slot at 6 in the morning before anyone was awake. Harry had been the one to collect it because he was always the one to collect the post, Vernon's standing order, and he'd nearly put it on the stack with the electric bill and the Tesco circular when something stopped him. The envelope was a deep, burnished gold, heavier than paper had any right to be, and it smelled faintly of stone and old metal. His name was on the front in ink that shifted color when he tilted it toward the light. Master Harrison James Potter. The cupboard under the stairs, number 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. He'd tucked it under his thin mattress without breathing. He still hadn't opened it. Something about the weight of it felt like a door he couldn't unwalk through, and 6 years of living with the Dursleys had taught him to be careful about doors. But tonight, with the cake finished and Dudley already in front of the television and Vernon in his armchair with the newspaper, Harry lay in the dark of the cupboard and pulled the envelope out and turned it over. The seal on the back was a coat of arms, a dragon, he thought, though it was hard to tell in the sliver of light from the gap under the door. Below it, in small precise letters, Gringotts Wizarding Bank. London Branch. Office of the Chief Account Curator. He broke the seal. The letter inside was short. Shorter than he expected for something that had traveled in an envelope that heavy. Master Potter, a routine inheritance scan conducted upon your 6th natal anniversary has returned results of significant concern to this institution. Your presence is requested at Gringotts Bank, Diagon Alley, London, at your earliest convenience. The matter is both urgent and private. Transportation has been arranged. Step outside your residence at 7 o'clock on the morning of June 2nd and present this letter to the driver. The bank takes full responsibility for your security during travel. Yours in contract, Sharpclaw, Senior Account Curator, Potter Estate. Harry read it twice. Then he folded it very carefully and held it against his chest in the dark and thought about what inheritance meant. He knew the word. He was good at words, read everything he could get his hands on, which at the Dursleys meant whatever Dudley had already broken the spine of and abandoned, plus anything in the school library that didn't require a checkout slip. Inheritance meant something left to you. Something that belonged to you because of who you came from. His parents had died. He knew that much, though the Dursleys' version, car crash, drunk driver, irresponsible people his parents had been, had always felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. Like a story with the middle pages torn out. He pressed the letter harder against his ribs and felt his heartbeat against it. June 2nd was tomorrow. The car that came was black and long and too clean for Privet Drive, and the driver was a goblin. Harry stood on the front step at 7 sharp and stared. He'd never seen a goblin before, had barely known goblins existed, outside a thin chapter in one of Dudley's discarded school encyclopedias of mythology that he'd read cover to cover twice, but he recognized what this was immediately, in the same instinctive way he recognized thunderstorms and the smell of frying bacon and other things that made the world feel more real than usual. The goblin was roughly 4 feet tall, dressed in a dark suit that fit him with military precision, and he had the kind of face that had clearly never wasted time on unnecessary expressions. He looked at Harry the way an accountant looks at a figure that doesn't add up, not unkindly, but with absolute focused attention. Master Potter, he said. His voice was like gravel shifted by a careful hand. Yes, Harry said. I am Sharpclaw. I sent the letter. He held out one hand, long fingers, too many knuckles. Your letter, if you please. Verification. Harry handed it over. Sharpclaw pressed his thumb to the seal, which flared briefly gold, and gave a short nod. Your relatives. Sharpclaw glanced at the door behind Harry. Have they been informed? No. A pause. Something moved behind the goblin's amber eyes that wasn't quite approval but was adjacent to it. Wise. Come. Harry came. The interior of the car was nothing like a normal car interior. It was bigger than it should have been, comfortable chairs, a small table, a partition of dark glass between them and the driver, who turned out to also be a goblin, sitting behind a steering wheel that seemed purely ceremonial given that the car appeared to be navigating primarily by intent rather than by any observable traffic laws. London blurred past the windows in shades of grey morning light. Sharpclaw spread a series of documents across the small table. They were dense with figures, columns and columns of numbers, dates, transaction records going back 5 years, all written in an ink that was a slightly different color from the paper in a way that made Harry's eyes want to track the differences. Do you know what a vault is? Sharpclaw asked. Like a bank account, Harry said. The goblin tilted his head. More permanent. More significant. A vault is a record of everything a family owns, has owned, and is owed. Your parents had a primary vault, Vault 687. You are its sole heir. He pressed a finger to the first column of numbers. This is the current balance. Harry looked. He didn't fully understand what he was seeing. The numbers were in Galleons, which meant nothing to him yet, but he could see that the column of numbers on the right was dramatically, obviously smaller than the column of numbers on the left. That's a lot less, he said. Yes, Sharpclaw said. It is. Where did the rest go? The goblin didn't answer immediately. He turned to the next page, which had a different set of columns, and then the next, and the next. 5 pages of transactions. 5 years of steady withdrawals, each one authorized by a signature at the bottom of the page in a slanted, elegant hand. Harry looked at the signature. He couldn't read the name, he'd never seen it before, but there was something about the loops of the letters, the way they leaned forward with absolute confidence, that made the back of his neck prickle. Who signed these? He asked. Sharpclaw looked at him for a long moment. The car moved through streets that were becoming older and narrower and more interesting. We will discuss that at the bank, the goblin said. With the chief. Harry nodded. He looked back at the pages and began, very quietly and very methodically, memorizing every number he could see. Diagon Alley in the early morning, before the shops opened, was a different creature from whatever it became when crowded. The cobblestones were wet from overnight rain. The painted signs above the shuttered shopfront swayed in the light breeze. A cat sat on the steps of what looked like a cauldron shop and watched Harry walk past with the specific indifference of an animal that has seen many strange things and categorized them all as beneath concern. Gringotts itself was enormous. Harry had half expected something underground, something hidden, something that matched the secrecy of the letter, but the bank was the most obvious building on the street, white marble and massive bronze doors, steps broad enough to land a small aircraft on, flanked by goblin guards in armor that caught the grey morning light and threw it back sharper. The guards didn't look at Harry as he walked between them. They looked at Sharpclaw, and Sharpclaw gave the smallest possible nod, and the doors swung open on their own. Inside, the marble floors reflected the torchlight with a cold, clean precision. Dozens of goblins worked at high counters, moving with that same focused efficiency Harry had noticed in Sharpclaw, writing in ledgers and speaking in low voices and occasionally dropping things into pneumatic tubes that disappeared into the walls with a thunk of pressurized air. Harry looked at all of it and filed it carefully. He was good at reading rooms, had gotten good at it young, and what this room said was, everything here is accounted for, everything is recorded, and nothing that belongs here will leave without consequence. He liked it, he decided. He liked it quite a lot. Sharpclaw led him not to the main counter but to a corridor behind it, then through a door that required a key and a palm press, then down a second corridor that was narrower and older feeling, the torches replaced with something that glowed without flame, steady as starlight. At the end of it was a door of iron banded with copper runes, and behind the door was a room that was clearly an office but felt more like a throne room that had grudgingly conceded to the existence of paperwork. The goblin behind the desk was old. Not in the way Vernon was old, pink and soft and settled, but in the way Stone was old. He had a face like a geological event, all sharp planes and deep lines, and his eyes were the color of old bronze and had probably seen 6 centuries of human foolishness without blinking. He was already looking at Harry when Harry walked in. "Sit," he said. "Not unkind. Just final." Harry sat. Sharpclaw took a position to the right of the desk and stayed standing. "I am Ragnarok," the old goblin said. "Chief of Gringotts, London. I have been chief for 114 years. He let that settle for a moment. "In that time, I have seen 43 inheritance scans return anomalous results. Errors in paperwork, miscalculations, fraud by minor functionaries, occasionally by family members, twice by ministry officials. 43 cases." He picked up a folder from his desk, thick, red-bound, sealed with a copper clasp. "This is the 44th. And it is, by a considerable margin, the worst I have seen." Harry's hands were flat on his knees. He kept them still. "The scan was triggered automatically on your 6th birthday," Ragnarok continued. "A standard process for accounts above a certain value threshold. The results came back in 4 hours. They should have taken 4 minutes." He opened the folder. The delay was because the systems kept rejecting the findings. They are designed to reject results that appear to be errors. The systems required 3 complete reruns and 1 manual override before they accepted that the numbers were accurate. "How much?" Harry asked. Ragnarok looked at him. A long look, assessing, the kind that wanted to see how a person sat under weight before deciding how much more to add. 12,462,000 galleons, Ragnarok said. Withdrawn across 61 separate transactions between July of 1981 and the present date. Each transaction authorized by a signature on Gringotts approved withdrawal instruments. Each instrument technically valid. Each one, upon examination, facilitated by a series of proxy authorizations that would only have been available to someone with the full trust designation of the Potter estate. 12 million. Harry didn't know exactly what a galleon was worth in pounds, but the context of the number was perfectly legible. It was a very great deal of money, taken in very careful pieces over 5 years, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "Who?" Harry said. Ragnarok turned the folder and slid it across the desk. The top page was a transaction summary, and at the bottom, in that same confident slanting hand Harry had seen in the car, was a signature. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. Harry looked at the name for a long time. He sounded it out in his head. He had never heard it before, or if he had, it hadn't stuck. Whoever Albus Dumbledore was, he hadn't been important enough to mention at number 4, Privet Drive. Vernon and Petunia didn't discuss the magical world. They discussed Dudley's football kit and the neighbor's new car and whether the hydrangeas were coming in right. "Who is he?" Harry asked. Sharpclaw made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had been a few degrees warmer. Ragnarok's expression didn't change. "Albus Dumbledore is currently the headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. He is the supreme mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards. He is the chief warlock of the Wizengamot, which is the wizarding world's governing body and highest court. He is considered by most witches and wizards in Britain to be the greatest wizard alive and, by many, the greatest wizard of the last several centuries." A pause. "He is also your magical guardian of record. Appointed by Ministry Instrument in November 1981, 10 days after your parents were killed. Harry was quiet for a moment. So he's the most powerful person in the wizarding world, Harry said. And he's been stealing from me since I was 1 year old. Yes. And he's supposed to be taking care of me. According to the ministry instrument, yes. Harry looked down at the folder. Turn to the next page. More transactions, more dates, the same signature over and over, each one neat and unhurried, as if the man had signed them the same way he'd sign a letter to an old friend, without a moment's hesitation or doubt. There's more, Ragnarok said. Harry looked up. The goblin opened a second folder, thinner, bound in black. The monetary theft is the largest part in terms of volume. But there is a secondary component that is, in some ways, more significant. He spread 8 sheets of parchment across the desk in a row, each one headed with a different crest, a different name. These are lordship designations. Magical inheritance titles attached to the Potter bloodline. Some through direct descent, some through magical adoption ceremonies conducted by your ancestors, some through conquest rights under old goblin recognized law. You are the legitimate heir to 8 of them. Harry looked at the 8 crests. He read the names printed below each one: Potter, Peveril, Gryffindor, Slytherin, Ravenclaw, Hufflepuff, Black, Emrys. He knew Gryffindor and Slytherin from mythology, vaguely. Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff were blanks. The others meant nothing yet. These were suppressed, Ragnarok said. Not stolen outright, the titles cannot be removed from the bloodline entirely without killing the holder. But they can be locked. Suppressed. Made legally dormant. A suppression requires a magical instrument signed by the holder or, in the case of a minor, by their guardian. He straightened the pages into a neat row. All 8 suppressions were filed by the office of the Chief Warlock between November 1981 and February 1982. The signatory on each instrument was Albus Dumbledore, in his capacity as your magical guardian. The room was very quiet. Harry could hear the distant mechanical sounds of the bank, the hum of it, the vast recorded industry of everything being accounted for. He locked me out of all of them, Harry said. Yes. While simultaneously using the proxy authority attached to the guardianship to access funds that should have been frozen pending your majority. Ragnarok folded his hands on the desk. Master Potter, I want to be precise with you, because you are 6 years old and I could choose to be imprecise and it would be easy and you would not know the difference. He paused. I do not choose to be imprecise. What Dumbledore did is, under Goblin law, one of the most serious financial crimes that exists. The deliberate systematic theft from a minor heir. The suppression of their titles to prevent them from having the legal standing to challenge the theft. It is the kind of crime that, in Goblin reckoning, would result in permanent seizure of the criminal's own assets and a blood debt to the wronged party. But this is wizarding law, Harry said. Yes. And under wizarding law, he is the chief warlock who presides over the court. Ragnarok's voice was flat. Which is why we are having this conversation here, in this office, without owing the ministry. Harry sat with that. He looked at the 8 crests again. 8 names, 8 inheritances, 8 somethings that were supposed to be his and had been quietly, expertly taken away before he was old enough to know they existed. Something shifted in his chest. Not grief exactly, he was 6 and grief was a concept he'd encountered in books but hadn't had cause to feel in any sustained way, because you had to know what you'd lost before you could miss it. This was something harder and cleaner. It was the feeling you got when something that had seemed like the way things were turned out to be the result of a decision someone made. And decisions could be undone. What can you do? He asked. Ragnarok looked at him for a moment with something that might have been satisfaction. Gringotts is not subject to the Wisengamot, he said. We are bound by the Treaty of 1394, which grants us independent legal standing in matters of financial contract and inheritance. We can file a challenge in our own name on your behalf. We can freeze any further access to your accounts, which has already been done, as of this morning. We can begin the formal documentation process to have the suppressions declared invalid. He leaned forward slightly. What we cannot do is move quickly. Dumbledore has spent 5 years constructing this arrangement very carefully. Unpicking it carefully will take time. Unpicking it carelessly will give him warning and time to prepare a defense. Then do it carefully, Harry said. Yes, Ragnarok said. We will. There was a pause in which the two of them, an ancient goblin chief who had seen a century of contracts and betrayals, and a 6-year-old boy with a scar on his forehead and bare knees where his 2 large genes had ridden up, looked at each other across a desk full of evidence of a crime, and reached an understanding. There are things you need to know, Ragnarok said. About your heritage. About what these names mean. About what the wizarding world looks like from a position of actual power rather than the position Dumbledore has arranged for you. He glanced at Sharpclaw, who moved to a cabinet and retrieved something. We are prepared to educate you, if you are willing to be educated. Gringotts has an interest in this matter beyond the professional. Dumbledore has been, difficult, for this institution for a long time. He has made our work harder in ways that are subtle enough to be defensible and deliberate enough to be intentional. Your case gives us the legal standing to address a number of those difficulties simultaneously. You want to use my case to deal with your problems with Dumbledore, Harry said. Ragnarok smiled. It was the first time his face had moved in that direction and it was, frankly, a bit alarming. Goblins had a lot of teeth. But it was a real smile. I want to be honest with you, he said. Yes. Our interests align. That does not make either of us wrong for pursuing them. Harry thought about this. He'd been living at the Dursleys for 5 years on the basis of somebody else's arrangement. The idea of someone else's interests aligning with his felt like the strangest luxury he'd ever been offered. What do you need from me? He asked. Sharpclaw set a small wooden box on the desk. Inside, on a bed of dark cloth, was a ring, old, heavy, the metal a color between gold and bronze, set with a stone that was dark red, almost black, engraved with a crest Harry didn't recognize yet. Your thumb, Sharpclaw said. A drop of blood on the stone. It will confirm the inheritance and give Gringotts legal standing to act as your representative in the filing. Harry looked at the ring. Then at Ragnarok. If I do this, he said, he'll know. Eventually. Yes, Ragnarok said. Eventually. And then what? Then, Ragnarok said, you will have 3 restored lordships, the beginning of a legal case that even the chief warlock cannot simply make disappear, and the full contractual backing of Gringotts Bank. He paused. And he will have a great deal to explain. Harry reached out and pressed his thumb to the stone. It pricked, a sharp, clean pain, and a single dark bead of blood welled up and was absorbed by the stone instantly, the way dry earth absorbs the first drop of rain. The ring pulsed once, warm, and then was still. Around the room, in the walls, Harry could hear something, not quite a sound, more like a vibration, as if deep below them, in the vault levels, something vast and old had shifted and settled into a new alignment. Ragnarok looked at the ledger on his desk. A column of numbers changed. Harry watched him watch it, and something in the goblin's expression, that granite stillness, shifted slightly. Not much. But enough to notice. It's confirmed, Sharpclaw said quietly. Yes, Ragnarok said. He was quiet for a moment. The 8 inheritances are confirmed in the bloodline. The suppressions are now on record as contested. The accounts are frozen against external access. He looked up. You are, officially, a ward of Gringotts Bank pending resolution of the challenge. Harry blinked. A ward? It means we are legally responsible for your interests. It means that if anyone attempts to make decisions about your life, your property, or your education without our approval, they are in violation of the Treaty of 1394 and we have grounds to pursue them directly. Ragnarok's expression settled back into its geological stillness. It also means, practically speaking, that you should not return to your relative's home. I wasn't planning to, Harry said. Sharpclaw made that almost laugh sound again. Good, Ragnarok said. He reached into a drawer and produced a smaller envelope, which he slid across the desk. This is a bank seal identification document in your name. This, another envelope, is a summary of the case in terms you can read. This, a small key on a plain ring, is access to a secondary account we have established to cover your immediate expenses. It contains 10,000 galleons. Enough for clothing, food, accommodation, and materials for the next several months. He paused. We have arranged a place for you to stay. A property held in trust by the bank, one of the lesser Potter holdings that was not accessible via the main estate accounts and therefore was not touched by Dumbledore's instruments. It has a caretaker. You will be safe there. Where is it? Harry asked. Suffolk. A village called Thornhaven. The property is called Linnet Cottage. He said it simply, without apology for the modest name. It is not large. But it is warded, clean, and entirely yours. Harry thought about the cupboard. The single candle removed from the birthday cake and dropped in the bin. The thin mattress and the smell of damp wood and the creak of the floorboard he'd memorized out of Survival. That's fine, he said. Ragnarok nodded. He seemed about to close the folder and end the meeting, and then he paused and looked at Harry with an expression that was, very briefly, something warmer than professional. Your father, he said, was one of 3 human clients I have personally enjoyed working with in 114 years. He came to this bank at 11 years old with his parents and sat exactly where you are sitting now, and he argued, successfully, that the vault growth projections Gringotts was offering were suboptimal and proposed an alternative investment structure that our senior analysts grudgingly admitted had merit. A pause. You have something of his manner. Harry held that for a moment. He didn't know what to do with it. Compliments were foreign enough at number 4 that they still felt slightly suspect, but he held it carefully. Thank you, he said. Then, because it felt important, for the letter. For doing this. You didn't have to send it. We had a contractual obligation to notify you of irregularities, Ragnarok said. You send it to my birthday, Harry said. The morning of my birthday. On the exact day the scan was triggered. Another pause. The goblin's expression didn't change. The timing was efficient, he said. Right, Harry said. He stood, picked up the 3 envelopes and the key, and tucked them inside his too large jacket. At the door, he paused and looked back at the folder with Dumbledore's name at the bottom of 61 transaction records. Ragnarok, he said. Master Potter. When this is over, when I get it all back, I want to know what he spent it on. Every galleon. I want to know exactly what my money built. The old goblin looked at him for a long time. Yes, he said finally. I thought you might. The car took Harry back to Privet Drive at 10 in the morning, and he walked in through the front door with the 3 envelopes inside his jacket and the small key in his palm and the careful weight of 12,462,000 galleons sitting somewhere behind his eyes. Aunt Petunia was in the kitchen peeling potatoes. She looked up when he came in. Her eyes went to his face. She'd always been good at reading his face for signs of trouble, the same way she read Vernon's face for signs of mood, and something in what she saw there made her hands still on the peeling knife. Where did you go? She said. Out, Harry said. He went to the cupboard. He packed what was worth packing, which was, his school notebook, the pen with the green ink that he'd found in a lost and found box, the 3 Dudley discarded books he'd read most, and a photograph he kept wedged behind the water pipe, a small blurry thing he'd found in the bin 2 years ago. In it, a woman with red hair was laughing at something the camera couldn't see. He didn't know for certain it was his mother. But it was the only photograph in the house he wanted. He put it all in the pillowcase because there was no bag. He went back to the kitchen. Petunia was still standing at the counter, peeling knife in hand, watching him with an expression he didn't have a word for, not quite fear, not quite the particular disdain she usually aimed at him. Something closer to discomfort. As if she'd always known something was held very carefully in place and was watching it begin, very slowly, to move. "I'm leaving," Harry said. "Someone's arranged a place for me to stay." "You can't," she said. Automatic. Reflex. "I can," Harry said. "I have an identification document from Gringotts Bank establishing guardianship of my person pending legal proceedings." He paused. "I'm 6. I don't fully know what that means yet. But I know it means you can't stop me." Petunia stared at him. The potato in her hand dripped water onto the linoleum. "Your parents," she started. "Were murdered," Harry said. "And I'd like to know more about that at some point. But right now I need to go." He hoisted the pillowcase and walked out of the kitchen and down the hall and out the front door, which he did not slam. He walked to the end of Privet Drive, turned right onto Wisteria Walk, and found the black car waiting at the corner, Sharpclaw standing beside it with the particular stillness of someone who had known exactly how long this would take. Harry got in. He didn't look back. He was 6 years old. He had 2 galleons worth of understanding of what lordships were, a key to a secondary account with 10,000 in it, a photograph of possibly his mother, and the name Albus Dumbledore burning quietly in his chest like the very first coal in a very carefully built fire. The car pulled smoothly into traffic and headed east towards Suffolk, and Harry opened the second envelope, the one Ragnarok had called the summary, and began to read. He read for 2 hours without stopping. By the time the car turned onto a narrow lane bordered by old oaks, he had finished the summary twice and had begun a list in the green-ink notebook of every question the summary had raised. The list was 4 pages long. Who was Emrys? What is a Wisengamot vote worth? How do lordships translate to actual power? Why did he lock them instead of just taking the money? What was he afraid of? That last question he underlined twice. The lane opened into a clearing, and there was Linnet Cottage, not small, actually, not compared to the cupboard under the stairs. A stone house with a garden that had gone properly wild in the way that only happens when something is loved and then neglected for years. Wisteria climbing the east wall. A wooden gate that needed a new hinge. Windows that were dark but intact. Standing at the gate was a goblin Harry hadn't met yet, younger looking than Ragnarok and Sharpclaw, with quick, bright eyes and ink-stained fingers. "Master Potter," she said. "I'm Ripclaw. I'm the estate manager for the Thornhaven property. I've been keeping the wards current and the structure sound." She pushed the gate open. "Welcome home." Harry looked at the cottage for a moment. The wild garden. The good stone walls. The windows that were his. "Thank you," he said. He walked through the gate. Behind him, at the bottom of the lane, Dumbledore's instruments had just gone quiet for the first time since November 1981, the last monitoring charm on Harry's primary account snuffed out by Gringotts' wardlock like a candle between 2 fingers, and somewhere in London, in a large, comfortable office full of whirring silver instruments, a single small device let out a thin, confused sound and stopped spinning. But Harry didn't know that yet. He was looking at the wisteria, and thinking about how he would need to learn what his father had known about vault growth projections, and what exactly the word Emrys meant in the context of a bloodline that Dumbledore had thought important enough to suppress. He went inside. The fire lit itself when he walked in. He decided that was a good sign. Chapter 2, The Weight of Names. The first week at Linnet Cottage, Harry slept for 11 hours a night. He didn't plan to. He lay down the first evening on a bed that had actual sheets and a pillow that wasn't flat as paper, and something in his body, some coiled, vigilant thing that had been running since before he could remember, simply let go, and he dropped into sleep like a stone into deep water and didn't surface until the light through the curtains was the particular gold of mid-morning. He woke feeling strange and slightly guilty about it, the way you feel when you've taken something you weren't sure you were allowed to have. By the 3rd day he'd stopped feeling guilty. By the 5th he'd accepted that his body was simply settling debts he hadn't known he owed it. Ripclaw ran the cottage with the same focused precision Harry had noticed in all the Gringotts goblins, methodical, efficient, not unkind. She produced meals at regular intervals, kept the wards current with a small set of instruments she checked each morning like a doctor checking vitals, and left Harry largely to himself in between, which was exactly what he needed. She didn't ask him questions about Privet Drive or make sympathetic faces or try to explain things to him in the careful, simplified way adults used when they decided a child couldn't handle the real version. When he asked her something, she answered it directly. When he didn't ask, she didn't volunteer. He liked her immediately and completely. The cottage had a library. Not a large one, a single room off the back hallway with shelves on 3 walls and a window seat that caught the afternoon sun, but it was full of things that had belonged to his family. Magical theory texts with margin notes in 2 different handwritings, one slanted and quick, one small and precise. A history of wizarding law that was so densely annotated it was practically 2 books layered on top of each other. A collection of genealogical records that unfolded like maps, bloodlines branching and converging across centuries of parchment. Harry started with the genealogy. He spread it on the floor of the library on the second day, sitting cross-legged with his green ink notebook open beside him, and traced the lines with his finger. Potter went back 8 generations on the British magical record, further in the continental records. The Peveril line was older, much older, and connected to Potter through a great-grandmother 7 generations back, a woman named Ignotus Peveril's granddaughter, who had married a Potter and brought 2 inheritances into the family tree in a single ceremony. That explained 2 of the 8 crests. Gryffindor and Slytherin were harder. He found them 3 pages into the deeper genealogy, in a section that covered what the records called conquest, inheritance and magical adoption by merit, old mechanisms, pre-ministry, the kind of thing that had been established in centuries when the founders were still alive and wizarding society was organized around completely different principles. The short version, as far as Harry could work out, was, Godric Gryffindor had died without blood heirs, and had left his magical lineage, the title, the seat, the hereditary magic, to a specific magical student whose demonstrated power and character he'd formally certified before the Wisengamot of the time. That student had been a Potter. The Slytherin inheritance was stranger, it had come through a branch of the Black family, who had acquired it through a different mechanism entirely, and connected to Harry not through Potter but through his mother's side, which meant Lily Evans had carried something in her bloodline that nobody had apparently bothered to explain to her. Harry sat back and looked at that for a long time. His mother had been Muggle-born. Everyone at Privet Drive said that like it explained something, like it was the full story. But here it was in the genealogy records, Lily Evans Potter, heir presumptive to the Slytherin seat through a convergent line that had run dormant in Muggle-raised squibs for 3 generations before resurging in her. Ripclaw, he called. She appeared in the doorway. Master Potter. Can dormant magical lines wake up in people who don't know they're magical? She looked at him, then at the genealogy spread across the floor. Yes, she said. It's uncommon but documented. The magic recognizes the blood regardless of the environment it grows in. Did my mother know? About Slytherin? I don't know what your mother knew. I can find out what the bank records say she was told. A pause. It's likely she wasn't told very much. The suppressions filed on your titles in 1982 covered all lines that ran through her as well. By that point she was dead and couldn't challenge them. Harry absorbed this. He looked back at the genealogy. He suppressed titles that would have been hers too, he said. In practice, yes. The inheritances only fully vest in a living heir, so the legal structure of the suppression targeted you. But suppressing your claim also erased any official acknowledgement of her lineage. Ripclaw was quiet for a moment. It was very thorough. He didn't want there to be any record, Harry said. Of what she was. Of what I am. No. Harry wrote in his notebook, why? What does my power threaten that his doesn't? He underlined it, added a star, and turned back to the genealogy. Ragnarok came to the cottage 8 days after Harry's arrival, arriving in the same black car without announcement, walking through the garden gate at 9 in the morning with Sharpclaw behind him and a leather satchel under one arm. Harry was in the library. He heard the gate and came out to meet them. "You've been reading," Ragnock said, looking at the ink stain on Harry's left hand. "I have questions," Harry said. "Good." The goblin came inside without waiting for an invitation, which Harry appreciated. Invitations were a performance and they both had more important things to do. "Let's sit." They sat in the kitchen, which was the most functional room in the cottage, with tea that Ripclaw produced without being asked and a plate of something that wasn't quite biscuits but was in that general family. Ragnock opened the satchel and produced a new folder. "Progress update," he said. "The formal challenge documents have been filed in Gringotts' internal legal registry. This creates a timeline, everything is dated, witnessed, permanent. Dumbledore cannot claim the documents don't exist because they are now part of our treaty record, which the Ministry does not have access to without our explicit permission." "Has he noticed?" Harry asked. "The account freeze would have triggered his monitoring instruments within a day of your visit." Ragnock stirred his tea with methodical precision. "He will have noticed that something has changed. He will not yet know the scale of it. What he knows is that access to the Potter primary vault has been suspended and that his guardianship instruments have gone quiet." "What does he think happened?" "Likely. He thinks there has been a bank error or a routine audit flag. He will have sent correspondence to our offices." Sharpclaw reached into the satchel and produced a letter sealed with a deep blue wax seal bearing an elaborate crest. "We received this 4 days ago." Harry looked at it. "Can I read it?" Ragnock slid it across the table. Harry opened it carefully. The letter was exactly what he would have expected from the most powerful wizard in Britain, beautifully written, warmly concerned, impeccably polite, and about as honest as a mirror in a funhouse. Dumbledore expressed his deep concern about an irregularity he'd been alerted to regarding the Potter accounts, his hope that the matter was simply a clerical issue, his eagerness to assist in any way possible, and his gentle reminder that as Harry's magical guardian he was both legally and personally invested in the boy's well-being. The signature at the bottom was the same as the one on 61 withdrawal records. "Did you reply?" Harry asked. "We sent a standard acknowledgement," Ragnock said. "We are reviewing the matter and will be in contact when appropriate." "Entirely true, entirely uninformative." Harry set the letter down. He looked at the signature for a moment, then looked away. "What are the next steps?" "There are 2 tracks," Ragnock said. "Legal and educational. The legal track is ours, we continue building the case, we challenge the suppressions one at a time in order of the strongest documentation, and we prepare for the eventual Wizengamot presentation." He paused. "The educational track is yours. You need to understand what you are inheriting before you inherit it. 8 lordships is not a simple matter of having a title. Each one carries seats on the Wizengamot, ancient family magics that are either suppressed or dormant, political and social obligations, and in some cases physical properties and holdings." "Tell me about the Emery's line," Harry said. Ragnock set down his tea. Sharpclaw, behind him, went very still. "You found that already," Ragnock said. It wasn't a question. It was in the genealogy. The line through Peveril goes back further than the others. Much further. The genealogy starts calling it Emery's when it goes back past the 12th century, and then the records get strange. The language changes. The notation system changes. Harry looked at him. "What is it?" Ragnock was quiet for a moment, a different quality of quiet than his usual stillness. This was the quiet of a person deciding how much of a very large thing to give someone at once. "Emery's is the oldest of your 8 inheritances," he said. "It is not a family name in the conventional sense. It is a magical designation, a title of origin. In the Goblin historical record, Emery's is the name given to the first recognized line of what wizards call wandless sovereign magic. Magic that doesn't require an instrument. Magic that is functionally unlimited in scope as long as the practitioner has the knowledge and will to direct it." He picked up his tea again. Your great-grandmother of 16 generations was the last fully realized Emrys practitioner. The line has been running diluted and dormant ever since. Your mother's Slytherin convergence and your father's Peveril line meeting in you, the inheritance scan flagged it because, according to our bloodline assessment, the convergence has produced a reactivation. Harry looked at him. You're saying I have dormant wandless magic. I'm saying you will, Ragnarok said. Whether it fully manifests depends on your development and training. But the potential is there. It is measurable in the bloodline assessment. It was almost certainly measurable to anyone who knew what to look for in 1981. Harry was quiet. It's why he suppressed them, he said. Yes. Not the money. The money was, what? Operational. He needed resources for something. The money, Sharpclaw said from behind Ragnarok, with the precise, uninvested tone of someone reporting a fact, was largely channeled into a fund that Dumbledore controls under the designation of the Order of the Phoenix. A private organization he established during the war against Voldemort. We have traced approximately 9 million galleons to that fund. The remaining 3 million appears to have been distributed to various individuals and institutions in smaller amounts, some of them Wizengamot members. Harry looked at Sharpclaw. He paid people. He invested in relationships, Sharpclaw said. Which is the same thing at a different resolution. So he took my money to fund his organization and to buy political loyalty, Harry said. And he suppressed my titles so that I wouldn't have the legal standing to find out and challenge him. That is our reading of it, Ragnarok said. And the wandless magic, the Emrys line, he suppressed it because a fully realized Emrys practitioner is not controllable, Ragnarok said bluntly. They do not need a wand registered with the ministry. They cannot be disarmed. They are not dependent on any institution for their magical capability. And they have, historically, been the only class of magical practitioners capable of operating outside the constraints that the current power structure relies on. He set his tea down and looked directly at Harry. Albus Dumbledore has spent his life constructing a very specific magical world order. Everything in it runs through him or past him. You, fully realized, would be the one person in that world who could stand completely outside it and not need anything he controls. Harry thought about the letter with its warm, impeccable politeness. The signature that appeared 61 times on withdrawal records. He wasn't just protecting himself financially, Harry said. He was managing a threat. Yes. He thinks I'm a weapon that needs to be controlled. We believe so. Harry looked down at his hands. Plain hands, ink-stained, too thin. He'd put on weight in the week at the cottage, but 5 years of the Dursleys didn't unhappen in 8 days. He turned them over and looked at his palms. He didn't feel like a weapon. He felt like a 6-year-old boy who had just learned that the most powerful wizard in the world had spent 5 years carefully making sure he grew up in a cupboard with no information, no resources, and no idea what he was. He closed his hands into loose fists. Start teaching me, he said to Ragnarok. The names, the titles, the legal structure. What each lordship means and what each one can do. I want to understand all of it. That will take considerable time, Ragnarok said. Then we'd better start now. They started with Potter, because it was the simplest and the most immediate, the primary name, the primary seat, the foundation on which the others sat. Ragnarok spread a new set of documents across the kitchen table and Harry learned that being Lord Potter was not simply a title but a functional legal status that carried one voting seat on the Wizengamot, control of the Potter family accounts and properties, and a set of ancient family magics that manifested as an unusual affinity for charm work and light transfiguration. The seat had been empty since James Potter's death. Empty seats didn't vote. Empty seats didn't speak. Empty seats didn't argue, challenge, or complicate the business of the people who filled the rest of the chamber. Ragnarok explained this without commentary, but the commentary was present anyway, the way the shape of something shows the space it used to fill. Then Peveril. Older, stranger, carrying an inheritance magic that Ragnarok described as deathly affinity, a sensitivity to the space between life and death, resistance to certain categories of lethal magic, and a historical connection to 3 objects that the goblin acknowledged with a particular careful neutrality, as if the objects themselves were in the room and listening. Harry made a note to ask about that later. Gryffindor and Slytherin took the longest, partly because they were the most politically charged and partly because the magical inheritances attached to them were the most complex. Gryffindor carried battle magic, not combat spells in the conventional sense but something older, a kind of magic that intensified under pressure, that grew in direct proportion to how much the practitioner cared about what they were fighting for. Harry liked the sound of that. Slytherin, conversely, carried what Ragnarok called Parseltongue sovereignty, control of serpentine magic and, at the deeper levels of the inheritance, a facility with mind magic that had nothing to do with dark arts and everything to do with the particular Slytherin genius for understanding what people wanted and what they feared. "Can I already do any of this?" Harry asked. Ragnarok considered the question. "The inheritances are suppressed, not absent. The magic is in your blood regardless of the legal instruments. What the suppressions do is prevent the formal recognition and training pathways from opening, they close the institutional doors. But the magic itself doesn't care about paperwork." He paused. "Have you had incidents? Unusual things happening when you were frightened or angry?" Harry thought about the time he'd ended up on the school roof when a gang of Dudley's friends was chasing him. One moment he was running, the next he was 2 stories up, sitting on the ridge tiles with no memory of climbing. He thought about the time Aunt Petunia had cut his hair viciously short and it had grown back to its normal state overnight. He thought about the time he'd looked at a locked door and it had simply opened, the tumblers turning with a sound like a sigh. "Yes," he said. "That is the magic working through the suppression," Ragnarok said. "In high-emotion situations, it breaks through. The stronger the emotion and the greater the need, the more reliably it surfaces." He looked at Harry steadily. "Removing the suppressions will not give you new power. It will give you access to power that is already there. Which is a much more interesting situation." Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff were the most straightforward in terms of the political structure, each carried a Wisengamot seat, but their inheritance magics were subtle. Ravenclaw carried an intellectual augmentation, a kind of magical enhancement to perception and pattern recognition, and Hufflepuff carried what Ragnarok described with a slightly puzzled expression as loyalty binding, an ancient magic that made oaths and contracts made in the Hufflepuff name functionally unbreakable at a level that even the most sophisticated countermagic struggled with. "Dumbledore would hate that one," Harry said. "He would," Ragnarok agreed. "A person with Hufflepuff binding authority can make any agreement they enter into ironclad. It removes the possibility of being manipulated through contractual language." The Black inheritance was last and most complicated, because the Black family was still alive and active, and the line connecting Harry to the Black seat ran through his godfather, Sirius Black, currently imprisoned in Azkaban without trial for the murder of 12 Muggles and the betrayal of James and Lily Potter to Voldemort. Harry stopped when Ragnarok said this. "Imprisoned without trial," he said. "Yes." "How long?" "Since November 1981. 5 years. "That's not legal," Harry said. "Even I know that's not legal. Under wizarding law, a ministry official can authorize temporary detention without trial. Temporary detention is defined as up to 6 months. Ragnarok's voice was very level. "Sirius Black has been in Azkaban for 5 years. On whose authority was he kept beyond the 6 months?" A pause. "The extension orders," Sharpclaw said from behind Ragnarok, with the exact tone of someone laying a card on a table, "were signed by the Chief Warlock." Harry put his pen down. He looked at the table for a moment. The 8 crests. The legal summaries. The transaction records with their 61 signatures. He thought about a man in prison for 5 years without a trial. He thought about the way Dumbledore had constructed this, not carelessly, not impulsively, but with meticulous, patient, long-sighted care. Each piece placed to support the others. The guardianship to access the accounts. The suppressions to prevent the legal challenges. The imprisonment of the godfather who might have questioned it. The monitoring charms to know if anything shifted. And Harry, at the center of all of it, in a cupboard under a staircase, eating less than Dudley's second helpings. Is Sirius Black actually guilty? He asked. That is not something Gringotts can determine, Ragnarok said carefully. What we can tell you is that the standard of evidence for his continued imprisonment does not meet treaty requirements, and that we have flagged this in our supporting documentation. Included in the challenge, Harry said. His imprisonment. The absence of a trial. Ragnarok nodded slowly. It will complicate the case. Good, Harry said. I want it complicated. I want every single thing Dumbledore did in my name laid out so that nobody can look at it and say it was an accident or a coincidence. I want the whole picture. He picked up his pen and went back to his notes. 3 weeks passed in that rhythm, mornings in the library, afternoons with Ragnarok or Sharpclaw, evenings sitting in the window seat watching the wild garden go gold in the late light. Harry grew half an inch, which Ripclaw noted in the cottage maintenance log with the same matter-of-fact thoroughness with which she noted the replacement of a cracked roof tile. He read every book in the library that he could understand and started on the ones he couldn't understand yet, keeping the notebook close for the things he'd need to come back to. On the 23rd day, he asked Ripclaw to teach him to cook. She looked at him with an expression that suggested she had not anticipated this request but was willing to accommodate it. Why? She asked. I want to know how, Harry said simply. I want to know how to do things. Practical things. Things that work regardless of what else is happening. She taught him. They made soup first, then bread, then the not-quite biscuits, which turned out to involve a technique for layering fat and flour that required more patience than Harry expected and produced better results than he'd anticipated. He practiced at the kitchen table in the evenings and burned 2 batches and got the third one right, and the small satisfaction of that, of having attempted something, failed at it, adjusted, and succeeded, was one of the cleanest feelings he'd had in recent memory. He was sitting at the kitchen table one evening with a plate of the not-quite biscuits and the Black family genealogy when Ripclaw came in with an owl on her arm and a small, carefully sealed envelope. From Ragnarok, she said. Harry opened it. The note inside was 5 lines. The first challenge instrument has been formally entered into the treaty record. The Potter Lordship suppression has been declared invalid on technical grounds. The proxy authorization used to file the suppression was not valid under 1394 Treaty Article 7 subsection 3. Legal challenge to be heard within 60 days. Dumbledore will know within the week. Prepare yourself. Harry read it twice. Set it down. Ate a not-quite biscuit and thought about the word prepare. He went to the library and found a book he'd been putting off, a dense, dry text called The Architecture of Wisengamot Proceedings that had been annotated in both the handwritings he was learning to think of as his father's and his mother's. The margin notes were an argument, his father dismissive of certain procedural technicalities, his mother patiently explaining why they mattered anyway, the exchange running across 40 pages with the easy confidence of 2 people who argued about everything because they could. He read it in one sitting. At 2 in the morning, when the cottage was quiet and the garden was silver under a full moon, Harry sat in the window seat and thought about what was coming. Dumbledore didn't know how much Harry knew yet. He knew there was a challenge. He probably thought it was a bank irregularity being investigated by Gringotts on their own initiative, some technicality they'd found, something he could explain or negotiate around. He didn't know there was a 6-year-old boy in Suffolk who had spent 3 weeks reading his parents' books and Ragnarok's legal documents and building a picture of exactly what had been done and exactly what it was going to take to undo it. That asymmetry was the most valuable thing Harry had right now, and he understood, with the clarity that comes at 2 in the morning when something clicks finally into focus, that it had a shelf life. So the question was what to do with it. He got up, went to the kitchen, and wrote a list by lamplight. Not the kind of list he made for himself, notes and questions, but a different kind. An action list. Things that needed to happen and in what order and why. He was halfway through it when something happened. He was reaching for the pen, which had rolled to the other side of the table, and without thinking, not reaching physically, just reaching, the way you reach for something in a dream when the rules of space are more flexible than they are in waking life. The pen moved. Skidded 2 inches across the table and stopped against his fingers. Harry looked at it. Then at his hand. Then at the pen. He put it down deliberately and picked it up again. Reached for the inkpot, which was further away, with the same quality of intention rather than physical movement, and the inkpot slid smoothly toward him across the table and stopped exactly where he wanted it. He looked at his hands again. Then he started laughing, quietly, so as not to wake Ripclaw, but genuinely, with the specific hilarity of something that is both surprising and entirely logical. Of course. The suppressions were in the process of being contested. Even filing the formal challenge had apparently started loosening something, not removing the block, but introducing a crack in it, and through the crack, his magic was doing exactly what Ragnarok had said it would. It didn't care about paperwork. He spent the next 20 minutes moving every object on the kitchen table with nothing but intention and a growing, irrepressible grin. Ragnarok arrived in the morning with Sharp Claw and, this time, a third goblin Harry hadn't met, a severe-looking older woman introduced as Blademark, who was Gringotts' senior treaty law specialist and who looked at Harry with the assessing expression of someone calibrating how much of a client's situation was salvageable. She apparently concluded that it was highly salvageable, because she opened her briefcase and spread 6 documents across the kitchen table with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been waiting to do exactly this. The Wisengamot hearing, she said, without preamble. 60 days. Under Treaty Article 12, a contested inheritance challenge must be heard before a full chamber session, which means every seated member will be present. You will be present. She looked at Harry. You will not speak. At 6 years old, under current wizarding law, a minor cannot address the Wisengamot directly. You will be represented by our legal team. I understand, Harry said. What about Dumbledore? He will be present. As Chief Warlock, he presides over the chamber. She said this with absolute flatness, the way you describe a structural problem in a building, not shocked, just precise. He cannot remove himself without acknowledging that his position is compromised, which he will not do. He will preside. He will attempt to use procedural mechanisms to delay or reframe the challenge. Can he? He can try, Blademark said. We are filing the documentation in such a way as to make delay structurally difficult. Each suppression challenge is treated as an independent instrument, with its own precedent chain, so he cannot dismiss the case on a single technicality and take all 8 with it. He has to fight each one individually. She paused. This was Ragnarok's design. Ragnarok, across the table, said nothing. His expression was the geological one. What about the money? Harry asked. The 12 million. That comes after the Lordships. The suppressions are the threshold issue, they were the mechanism that prevented you from having standing to challenge the financial transactions. Restore the Lordships first, establish your legal standing, then pursue the financial recovery. She tapped one of the documents. Our conservative estimate is that the hearing will restore 3 to 5 of the 8 Lordships outright, with the remainder requiring secondary proceedings. The most straightforward cases are Potter, Peveril, and Hufflepuff. The technical grounds for the suppression on each of these are clearly invalid. Gryffindor and Slytherin are more complex because of the conquest inheritance mechanism, which Dumbledore's legal team will challenge. He has a legal team. He will, Blademark said. He doesn't know the full scope of the case yet. When he does, he will assemble one. Who would help him? Harry asked. Not accusatory, genuinely curious. Blademark and Ragnarok exchanged a look. People who have benefited from his arrangement, Ragnarok said. And people who genuinely believe that whatever he has done, he is the greater good, that the disruption of his position is more dangerous than the wrongdoing that caused it. Harry thought about that. He thought about the 9 million galleons channeled into the Order of the Phoenix and the 3 million distributed in smaller amounts to individuals and institutions. He thought about what you could build with 12 million galleons worth of loyalty, of dependency, of obligation. He built himself a support network with my money, Harry said. And now those people will defend him to protect the thing their support paid for. Yes, Ragnarok said. That is a precise summary. Harry looked at the 6 documents on the table. He reached out and moved them into a neat row with his hands, actual hands, not the new trick, and looked at each heading in turn. There's someone, he said slowly. In the genealogy notes. My father made references to other families, the Longbottoms. He mentions Augusta Longbottom twice in the margin notes on the Wisengamot Procedures book. He says she's the most inflexible woman in wizarding Britain and that this is one of her better qualities. Blade Mark looked up sharply. Why do you ask about Augusta Longbottom? Because inflexible people don't change their positions for money, Harry said. And because the Longbottom family has a Wisengamot seat. Does she vote? She votes, Ragnarok said carefully. She has voted in opposition to Dumbledore on 6 occasions in the past 3 years. Each time on procedural grounds, she is meticulous about process. He paused. She has also been quietly attempting to investigate the circumstances of her son and daughter-in-law's incapacitation. They were tortured into permanent incapacity by Death Eaters in November 1981, shortly after Voldemort's fall. The investigation was closed by the Ministry without sufficient conclusion. Harry looked at him. On whose authority? Ragnarok's expression didn't change. Right, Harry said. He wrote Augusta Longbottom in his notebook and put a circle around it. The hearing, he said. Do I have to be silent the whole time? Legally, yes, Blademark said. A minor cannot address the chamber. But I'll be there. Yes. And Dumbledore will be presiding. Yes. He'll look at me, Harry said. Nobody answered this, because it wasn't a question. Harry thought about what it would be like. The most powerful wizard in the world, looking at a 6-year-old boy across a courtroom that the boy's own money had probably paid for, presiding over a case about his own crimes with the absolute, unruffled composure of a man who had never once doubted that he would find a way to make it all work out in his favor. He thought about what it would feel like for Dumbledore to look at him and find, behind Harry's eyes, not the lost confused child he'd been building toward, not the weapon without knowledge of its own nature, but a boy who had spent 3 weeks in a library, who had been reading his parents' books, who had an action list, who could move objects across a table with nothing but intention and had been practicing it every evening since. He thought it would probably feel quite different from what Dumbledore was expecting. Good, Harry said. He closed his notebook. I want to be there. I want him to know I'm there. The last thing that happened before the preparation for the hearing consumed everything else occurred on a Tuesday, in the Wild Garden, in the late afternoon when the light was at its most golden. Harry was sitting on the stone bench near the wisteria, his regular evening spot, good for thinking, when the garden gate opened and a boy his age appeared at the end of the path. He was round-faced and slightly mud-stained, with the expression of someone who had ended up somewhere unexpectedly and wasn't entirely sure what the protocol was. He held a trowel in one hand, for reasons that were unclear. He looked at Harry. Harry looked at him. Hello, the boy said. I think I ended up in your garden by accident. I was trying to get to the patch of monkshood behind the Renwick farm and I went a bit wrong. He held up the trowel in a vague explanatory way. Gran says I have to collect it myself if I want to learn herbology properly. She doesn't believe in buying what you can grow. Your grandmother sounds sensible, Harry said. She's terrifying, the boy said, with the matter-of-fact honesty of someone fully at peace with this. But usually right. He looked at the cottage, then back at Harry. Did you just move in? This place has been empty as long as I can remember. 3 weeks ago, Harry said. I'm Neville, the boy said. Neville Longbottom. We live about half a mile that way. He pointed with the trowel in a direction that was possibly northeast. Harry looked at him for a moment, at the open, unguarded face, the mud on his knees, the trowel. He thought about the name in his notebook with a circle around it. He thought about the margin note in his father's handwriting, most inflexible woman in Wizarding Britain. One of her better qualities. He thought about November 1981 and a closed investigation. Harry, he said. Harry Potter. Sit down if you want. I was just thinking. Neville sat on the other end of the bench with the natural ease of someone who sat on outdoor furniture with strangers reasonably often. He put the trowel across his knees. He looked at the wisteria. That needs cutting back, he said. The east side. It'll start pulling the mortar apart in another year if you don't manage it. I'll tell the estate manager, Harry said. You have an estate manager? Neville looked at him with frank curiosity. It's complicated, Harry said. Okay, Neville said simply. He didn't push it. Harry filed this as a point in his favor. They sat in the garden for another hour in a comfortable silence punctuated by occasional observations about the plants. Neville identified 6 of the wild species growing along the back wall with the casual authority of someone who had been learning this since before he could reliably walk. Harry asked about 2 of them and received answers that were precise, practical, and delivered without any of the self-conscious awkwardness that Harry had noticed in other children when they knew something better than the person they were with. When Neville finally stood to leave, Gran will send an owl if I'm not back by 6, and the owl is almost as terrifying as Gran. He paused at the gate. There's a wizarding library in the village, he said. Just past the post office. You probably know about it already. I didn't, Harry said. It's good. Better than it looks. He pushed the gate open. I go Thursdays usually, if you want to come. I might, Harry said. He watched Neville disappear up the lane, trowel swinging. Then he looked back at the wisteria, at the east side where the stems were beginning, very slightly, to curl toward the mortar. He pulled out his notebook and opened it to the action list. Below everything else, at the bottom, he wrote, Neville Longbottom. Potential ally. Good instincts. Trustworthy tone. Then he crossed out potential ally and just wrote, friend. It was the first time he'd written that word in the notebook. He looked at it for a moment, then closed the book, and went inside to practice moving objects before dinner. Chapter 3, The first move. The Wizengamot chamber was underground. Harry hadn't expected that. He'd built a picture of it from the architecture book and his father's margin notes, something grand and exposed, the kind of room that knew it was important. But the entry was through a ministry building that smelled of floor polish and bureaucratic anxiety, down 2 lifts, through a corridor lined with portraits of witches and wizards who watched Harry pass with expressions ranging from mild curiosity to outright suspicion, and then through a pair of doors so heavy they moved in silence, which was somehow worse than the sound they should have made. The chamber itself was circular. Tiered seating rose in concentric rings around a central floor space, the seats dark wood and high-backed, each one occupied by a witch or wizard in plum-colored robes. The ceiling was high and vaulted and spelled to look like a cloudy sky, which Harry found slightly absurd. They were underground, there was no sky, but apparently someone had decided that a chamber this important needed the suggestion of open air above it. Torches burned in iron brackets. The whole room smelled of old magic and older arguments. Every head turned when Harry walked in. He was wearing new clothes. Ripclaw had seen to that 2 weeks ago with the second-hand shop in Hogsmeade, which had better fit than anything Dudley had discarded and considerably more dignity. Dark trousers, a grey jacket, boots that actually matched his feet. He was still 6. He was still small. He walked across the central floor behind Blademark and Sharpclaw with his hands at his sides and his chin level and looked at the tiered seating with the same expression he used on the wild garden, interested, assessing, not remotely intimidated. He found Dumbledore immediately. The Chief Warlock's chair was elevated slightly from the rest, at the far end of the chamber's central axis, and Dumbledore sat in it the way water fills the shape of its container, completely, naturally, as if the chair had been built specifically to his dimensions. He was older than Harry had imagined, with the long white beard and the half-moon spectacles and the expression of serene, benevolent calm that his letter had foreshadowed. He looked like every portrait of wisdom that Harry had ever seen in a book. He looked like someone who made other people feel reassured simply by existing. He looked at Harry with that expression, the warm, sad, compassionate one, and Harry looked back at him with the flat, clear gaze of someone who has read 61 transaction records and does not find warmth reassuring when it comes from a specific source. Something very brief moved across Dumbledore's face. Not alarm. Adjustment. He had expected something different, Harry realized. He had expected, what? A lost child, maybe. Something frightened and confused that would need to be managed. He had not expected this particular quality of attention looking back at him from across the chamber. Harry took his seat beside Blademark in the visitor section, crossed his feet at the ankles, and opened his notebook. Blademark had explained the procedure in exhaustive detail over the preceding 2 weeks, which meant Harry could follow the opening formalities without losing the thread. The certification of quorum, there were 92 members present out of a possible 112. The reading of the session agenda. The formal entry of the treaty challenge, submitted by Gringotts Bank on behalf of the minor heir Harrison James Potter, contesting the suppression of the Potter family lordship on the grounds of invalid proxy authorization under Treaty Article 7, subsection 3. Dumbledore's voice, reading the agenda, was measured and rich and did exactly what a good voice does in a large room. It made the room feel smaller and more intimate, as if he were speaking privately to each person in it. The first matter before this session, he said, is the challenge submitted by Gringotts Bank regarding the Potter estate. He paused, and his pause was perfectly calibrated, just long enough to signal gravity without suggesting discomfort. Before we proceed to the substance of the challenge, the Wisengamot has received a procedural motion from our colleagues in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement requesting that the matter be referred to an investigatory committee, as is standard practice for challenges of this nature that involve point of treaty order, Blademark said. Her voice, by contrast to Dumbledore's, was like a scalpel, not loud, but precise enough to cut through anything in its path. A murmur moved through the chamber. Dumbledore turned his gaze to Blademark with the expression of a man who is entirely unsurprised by an objection and entirely prepared for it. The goblin representative is recognized. The Treaty of 1394, Article 12, subsection 1, states explicitly that a formally entered treaty challenge regarding inheritance rights must be heard at the session at which it is entered or the following session, and may not be referred to committee without the written consent of the challenging party. Blademark set a document on the table in front of her. Gringotts does not consent to referral. This matter will be heard today. Another murmur. Louder this time. A man 3 rose up in the tiered seating. Harry had learned to identify him from Blademark's briefings as Cornelius Fudge, the Minister for Magic, pink-faced and dressed in a lime-green bowler hat that belonged in a much less serious setting, leaned forward with an expression of important-looking concern. Surely some accommodation can be made for the complexity of, the treaty does not make accommodations for complexity, Blademark said. She was still looking at Dumbledore. The treaty makes accommodations for justice. Shall we proceed? Dumbledore smiled. It was an extraordinary smile, patient and warm and just slightly regretful, the smile of a man being tested by circumstances he finds mildly unfortunate. Of course, he said. Please proceed. Harry wrote in his notebook, he's not worried yet. He thinks he has room to maneuver. Blademark's presentation of the Potter Lordship challenge took 40 minutes, which was 38 minutes longer than it needed to be and 2 minutes shorter than it could have been. She was, Harry had come to understand, a lawyer of the specific type who buries you in documentation the way a river buries a stone, patiently, thoroughly, until the stone is no longer visible as a stone but as part of the riverbed. She presented the proxy authorization chain for the original suppression filing, demonstrated where it broke down under Treaty Article 7 subsection 3, produced 3 separate precedents from Goblin legal records showing identical technical failures in previous suppression instruments, and concluded by noting that the filing had been made using an authorization category that had not, in fact, existed in its claimed form at the time it was used. In other words, the legal instrument used to suppress Harry's Potter lordship had been forged. Not clumsily, very well, actually, well enough to stand up to routine scrutiny for 5 years. But the forgery was there, and now that Gringotts had identified it, it was perfectly legible. Dumbledore listened to all of this with the same serene expression. When Blademark finished, he looked down at the chamber floor, at Harry, and then at the assembled Wizengamot. The Wizengamot is grateful to Gringotts for their thorough review, he said. These are, as I think we must all acknowledge, deeply concerning findings. I want to assure this chamber and, most importantly, young Harry, the warm glance again, aimed at Harry with surgical precision, that I welcome this scrutiny. The Potter estate's integrity is of paramount importance, and if there have been irregularities in the documentation, they must be corrected. Harry wrote, he's welcoming the challenge. That means he thinks he can survive it. The question before this chamber, Dumbledore continued, is narrow and procedural. The suppression instrument's technical validity. If the documentation is defective, the suppression is invalid and the Lordship is restored. I see no reason to delay that outcome if the evidence supports it. He looked at Blademark. The evidence you have presented, on its face, supports it. I will not oppose the restoration of the Potter Lordship. Silence. Harry looked at Blademark. She was looking at Dumbledore with an expression of absolute professional neutrality that Harry had learned, over 3 weeks of watching her face, meant she had anticipated exactly this and had responses ready. The Chief Warlock's cooperative stance is noted, she said. However, Gringotts has filed challenges on not 1 but 6 suppression instruments today. She produced 5 more folders. Peveril. Hufflepuff. Gryffindor. Slytherin. Black. She set them on the table one by one, each one landing with a small solid sound that carried. The Potter challenge was the procedural entry point. We are prepared to present all 6. The silence in the chamber changed quality. It got heavier. Dumbledore looked at the 5 folders. The serene expression held. He was very good, Harry noted, but the pause before his response was fractionally longer than his other pauses had been. These are considerably more complex matters, he said. They are, Blademark agreed pleasantly. We have considerably more documentation. From the tiered seating, a voice cut through with the particular carrying quality of someone who had spent decades making themselves heard in this room. I move that all 6 challenges be heard today under Article 12. Harry didn't need to look up the name. Augusta Longbottom was exactly what his father's margin notes had promised, a woman built on the principle that inflexibility, properly applied, was a form of integrity. She was tall, sharp-featured, wearing robes that were formally impeccable and a hat with a stuffed vulture on it that Harry thought might be his favorite thing in the room. The motion requires a second, Dumbledore said, still measured. Seconded. A different voice, older, female, from the far right of the chamber. Harry made a note of the location to identify later. The motion carries, said a third voice, before Dumbledore could frame any response. Several more voices followed, overlapping, a cascade of seconds and a sense that Dumbledore let settle without attempting to override. He was too smart to fight the momentum in the room. He let it run. He was recalibrating, Harry understood. He had walked in expecting to concede the Potter challenge cleanly and gracefully, demonstrate his cooperation, and use that goodwill to slow or derail the others. The simultaneous filing of all 6 had taken that option away. Now he had to fight on 6 fronts at once in a chamber where Augusta Longbottom had just shown that the political ground was softer than he'd expected. Harry looked down at his notebook and wrote, for the first time with real satisfaction, he's worried now. The Peveril challenge ran for 2 hours and ended in restoration. The technical grounds were even cleaner than the Potter case. The authorization mechanism used for the Peveril suppression had been the same proxy document, which meant the precedent established in the Potter ruling applied directly. Dumbledore argued briefly that the Peveril inheritance's historical complexity warranted independent review, was overruled by Blademark on treaty grounds, argued again that the precedent should not apply cross-inheritance, was overruled by a chamber vote of 61 to 29, and then, smoothly, with the warmth fully intact, as if he were doing Harry a favor, conceded. 2 Lordships, by lunchtime. The chamber broke for 30 minutes. Harry ate the sandwich Ripclaw had packed, sitting in the visitor section while the Wisengamot members moved around the room in the specific patterns of people conducting rapid political calculations under the guise of socializing. He watched Augusta Longbottom cross the chamber floor and speak briefly to the woman who had offered the second on her motion, broad-shouldered, dark-skinned, with the expression of someone who dealt in facts and found most of the current proceedings frustratingly overdue. Harry wrote her name in his notebook when he heard someone address her, Amelia Bones. DMLE. He watched Dumbledore. The chief warlock stood at the center of a cluster of robed figures, speaking quietly, one hand briefly on someone's arm, the warmth deployed like a tool with precise aim. Harry watched him work the room with the specific attention of someone learning a technique they intend to develop differently. The technique was real. The warmth was real, even. Harry didn't think Dumbledore was performing concern that he didn't feel. The problem was that the concern was directed at an outcome, not at a person. Every gesture was subordinate to the larger strategy. It was, Harry thought, a very sophisticated way to use genuine emotion for manipulative ends. He went back to his sandwich. After lunch, the Hufflepuff challenge lasted 40 minutes and ended in restoration with a chamber vote of 72 to 18. The legal grounds were impeccable and nobody except Fudge argued seriously against it, and Fudge's argument was sufficiently incoherent that Blademark didn't bother refuting it, she simply let it finish and then proceeded as if it hadn't happened. 3 Lordships. All before 3 in the afternoon. The Gryffindor and Slytherin challenges were where it got complicated. Dumbledore's legal representative, a ministry barrister named Crouch who had the angular efficiency of a man who believed in the law the way a hammer believes in nails, entered the chamber for the afternoon session and immediately filed a countermotion challenging the conquest inheritance mechanism that connected Harry to both the Gryffindor and Slytherin seats. The conquest inheritance records predate the Treaty of 1394, Crouch argued, and are therefore not subject to the treaty's inheritance protection clauses. They fall under ministry jurisdiction, not goblin legal standing. Blademark looked at him the way the ocean looks at a moderately ambitious sand castle. The records predate the Treaty of 1394, she said. The bloodline doesn't. The inheritance rests in the blood, which is present, alive, and documented in our records. The treaty protects bloodline inheritances regardless of the age of their origin instruments. This is settled law from 1612. The 1612 precedent applies to family inheritances, not conquest designations. The 1612 precedent applies to all bloodline inheritances recognized in Goblin Treaty records. Gryffindor and Slytherin are both in our records, have been since 1437, and the recognition predates any ministry claim to jurisdiction by 2 centuries. It went like this for an hour. Harry followed it closely, annotating in his notebook, building an understanding of where the argument was genuinely contested and where Crouch was deploying noise to run down the clock. He noticed, and made a note of this, starring it, that Dumbledore himself said very little during this session. He presided. He watched. He let Crouch carry the argument. Which meant Crouch was the disposable piece, Harry thought. If the Gryffindor and Slytherin challenges failed, Crouch absorbed the loss. If they succeeded, Dumbledore had fought them at appropriate remove. Either way, he emerged with his own position intact. It was elegant. Harry wrote elegant in his notebook and then drew a box around it and then crossed it out, because elegant wasn't the right word. Elegant implied something clean. The right word was insulated. Dumbledore had spent decades building insulation around himself. Every structure in the arrangement existed partly to protect the others and partly to protect him from direct contact with any specific consequence. The Gryffindor challenge ended at 5 in the afternoon with a preliminary ruling, not a full restoration, but a finding that the challenge had sufficient merit to proceed to a secondary hearing with additional documentation. Dumbledore accepted this without expression. The Slytherin challenge was tabled to the same secondary hearing. So, 3 fully restored today. 2 moving forward. The Black Challenge, which Blademark had entered last and deliberately not argued yet, remained on the table. "The Black Challenge," Dumbledore said. His voice was exactly the same as it had been all day, measured, warm, controlled. "Given the sensitive circumstances surrounding Sirius Black's current legal situation, I would suggest, Augusta Longbottom said from the tiered seating, in a voice like a gavel, that the Chief Warlock's use of the phrase sensitive circumstances to describe 5 years of imprisonment without trial is an insufficient characterization of the situation and that this chamber should be embarrassed to have allowed it to continue." The murmur that followed this was louder than any previous murmur. Harry looked at Augusta Longbottom. She was looking at Dumbledore with an expression that made the stuffed vulture on her hat seem somehow appropriate. Dumbledore met her gaze. "The circumstances of Sirius Black's imprisonment are a matter for the DMLE, I am right here," Amelia Bones said from the far right, in a tone that suggested she had been waiting for this moment specifically. "And I have been asking for the extension authorization records for Sirius Black's detention for 8 months and have repeatedly been informed that the documents are under Chief Warlock review." She paused. Would the Chief Warlock care to address that directly? The chamber went quiet in a different way than before. Not the heavy silence of complexity, the specific silence of a room where everyone has just understood that something is happening that they will remember. Dumbledore looked at Amelia Bones. Then at Augusta Longbottom. Then, briefly, at Harry. Harry looked back. Dumbledore said, "I will authorize immediate release of those records to the DMLE." "Today," Bones said. "Today," Dumbledore agreed. It was smoothly done, concession framed as cooperation, retreat framed as reasonableness. But it was a retreat. Harry had been watching his face all day, and this was the first moment that something behind the serene expression moved with what looked like genuine effort at containment. Blademark leaned slightly toward Harry and said, in a voice pitched below the chamber's renewed murmur, "The Black Challenge has been noted. We will hear it in the secondary proceedings with Gryffindor and Slytherin." Harry nodded. He was still looking at Dumbledore. The Chief Warlock was speaking to Fudge now, one hand on the minister's arm, the expression recalibrated back to warmth. But something had shifted in the room's geometry, in the way the other members were sitting, in the angle of Amelia Bones's attention, in the specific quality of Augusta Longbottom's silence. The chamber had come in this morning with one understanding of Albus Dumbledore and was leaving with a slightly different one, and that difference, however small, was a crack. Cracks were where things started. Afterward, in the corridor outside the chamber, waiting for Blademark to complete the formal session paperwork, Harry was standing with sharp claw when footsteps came up behind them and stopped. He turned. Dumbledore stood 2 feet away. Up close he was taller than he'd seemed from across the chamber, and the half-moon spectacles caught the corridor torchlight and made his eyes hard to read, which Harry suspected was deliberate. He had the warm expression on. He was looking at Harry with something that was probably meant to feel like affection. "Harry," he said. "Mr. Dumbledore," Harry said. A fractional pause. "I believe most people use the title Headmaster or Chief Warlock, I'm aware," Harry said. "I wanted to establish the register of the conversation early." Sharpclaw beside him made no sound at all, which was somehow the loudest response in the corridor. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a moment. Truly looked, the way he hadn't quite done across the chamber floor. Harry let him look. He was 6. He had ink on his hand from taking notes all day and he was wearing second-hand boots and he was standing in a ministry corridor having just recovered 3 of his 8 lordships and he met Dumbledore's gaze with absolute, unafflicted steadiness. "You've been reading," Dumbledore said. "I have," Harry said. "Your father used to say that. He'd read something and walk into a room differently." A pause. Something genuine in his voice now, not the performed warmth, but something underneath it, older and more complicated. "You look like him. The eyes are your mother's." "I know," Harry said. "I've seen a photograph." "I'm very sorry, Harry," Dumbledore said, and the shift in register was startling, the formality dropped, and for a moment he sounded like an old man who was tired. "For the circumstances of your early childhood. That you were placed where you were, that you lacked resources, you arranged the placement, Harry said. And the resources were in a vault in Gringotts. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. There are things you don't yet understand. About the war. About what was necessary. About the protections that, I understand 61 transaction records, Harry said. I understand 8 suppression instruments filed in my name before I was 18 months old. I understand a proxy authorization that your own barrister couldn't defend in the chamber today. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. I'm willing to understand other things as well, when they're explained to me. But I'm not going to pretend that I don't understand the things I already do. A long silence. The corridor was empty except for the 3 of them. The portraits on the walls were very still, which Harry suspected meant they were listening intently and trying to look like they weren't. You are, Dumbledore said slowly, very much not what I expected. No, Harry said. I imagine not. Something moved in Dumbledore's expression, not malice, not even cunning. Something closer to genuine reassessment. The look of a man who has built a model of a situation and is watching it fail to predict the observed data. The proceedings will continue, Dumbledore said. There are complexities in the remaining challenges that you should be prepared for. The magical world is, I'm reading about it, Harry said. I'll be ready. Another pause. Dumbledore looked at him for one more moment, with what Harry thought might actually be something like respect, or at least its immediate predecessor, and then nodded once and walked away down the corridor, his robes moving silently, his footsteps swallowed by the stone floor. Harry watched him go. He didn't threaten you, Sharpclaw said. He sounded thoughtful. No, Harry said. Why do you think that is? Harry considered. Because threatening me would mean acknowledging that I'm a threat worth threatening, he said. He's not ready to do that yet. He still thinks he can manage this. He watched the corridor until Dumbledore turned the corner and disappeared. He'll try a different approach next. Something that looks like reconciliation. And when he does? I'll listen, Harry said. And keep filing documentation. The walk back through the Ministry building was quieter than the walk in. The session had run until nearly 6 in the evening and the corridors were emptying, the last witches and wizards collecting their things from offices, the portraits settling into their evening gossip. Blademark met them at the lift with a briefcase full of sealed documents and the expression of someone who has performed significant legal surgery and is quietly satisfied with the outcome. 3 restored, she said. The secondary hearing for Gryffindor, Slytherin, and Black is in 30 days. Good, Harry said. What do we need for the secondary hearing? More documentation on the conquest inheritance mechanisms. I want historical precedent from the goblin records going back to at least 1200, and I want the Slytherin bloodline documentation from your mother's side of the genealogy re-entered under full treaty certification. She paused. We also need to prepare for Crouch to file a preemptive challenge to the goblin legal standing argument. He'll try to move the case to a ministry tribunal. Can he do that? He can try, Blademark said. The answer will be the same as it was today. The lift arrived with a cheerful ding that seemed entirely wrong for the setting. They got in. The lift ascended with a mechanical dignity that Harry appreciated. Blademark, he said. Master Potter. The 4 million, he said. The financial recovery. When do we begin formally? She looked at him. After the Lordships are fully restored. You need the legal standing, I have 3 seats now. Provisional legal standing. For the specific challenges heard today, yes. The broader financial recovery requires full standing, Harry said. I know. I'm asking about the timeline. He looked up at her. How long? She was quiet for a moment. If the secondary hearing goes as today did? 3 months, perhaps 4. And then? And then, Blademark said, with what Harry thought might be the closest thing to a smile she was capable of, we file the largest single financial recovery action in Gringotts treaty history. The lift reached the atrium. The golden ceiling glittered overhead. Harry walked through it and through the flue network entrance that Sharpclaw indicated, stepping into green fire and through into the network and out into the village of Hogsmeade, and walked the familiar lane toward the road to Thornhaven in the cooling evening air, the notebook under his arm, 3 lordships restored, 5 still waiting, and the image of Dumbledore's face when he'd said I'm aware sitting in his chest like a small, clean flame. The garden gate was open when he got home. Neville was sitting on the stone bench with a book open in his lap, apparently entirely comfortable with the idea of waiting in someone else's garden, and he looked up when Harry came through. "How did it go?" Neville asked. Harry paused. He hadn't told Neville the details, it was too complicated, too layered, and he wanted to make sure Neville had the full picture of everything before Harry asked anything of him or his grandmother. But Neville had known something significant was happening today and had showed up anyway, which said something specific. "Better than expected," Harry said. "Worse than ideal. About right for a first move." Neville nodded as if this was perfectly sensible. "Gran wants to meet you," he said. "She didn't say that exactly, but she asked what you were like and then she described what you were probably like and got it mostly right, so I think she's been paying attention." Harry sat on his end of the bench. The evening was cool and the wisteria smelled good, and somewhere in the garden something was making a quiet repetitive sound that was possibly a cricket or possibly small magic of some kind. "Tell her I'd like to meet her too," Harry said. "Okay." Neville looked back at his book, which appeared to be something about root systems. "Did you know monkshood has a secondary growth structure that most people don't bother with? You can extend the useful season by about 6 weeks if you tell me," Harry said. So Neville told him, in the comfortable and specific way of someone describing something they genuinely loved, and Harry listened, and the evening settled around them, and 3 floors beneath a ministry building on the other side of London, the Wisingamot session records were being sealed and logged by a junior official who would later that night have a very interesting conversation with a senior official about what exactly had happened in Chamber 7 today, and what it might mean for tomorrow. That night, after Neville had gone home and Ripclaw had produced dinner, Harry sat at the kitchen table with the notebook and added to the action list. Gryffindor, Slytherin, Black, 30 days. Augusta Longbottom, arrange meeting. Amelia Bones, watch. May become ally if serious Black records surface the way they should. Dumbledore's next move, reconciliation approach. Watch for. Financial recovery timeline, 4 months approximately. He looked at the list for a while. Then added one more line at the bottom. He said I look like my father. He looked at that one for a moment, then closed the notebook. Ripclaw appeared in the kitchen doorway. You should eat before it gets cold. Right, Harry said. He put the notebook aside and pulled the plate toward him. Outside, the garden was dark and the wisteria moved slightly in the evening wind, the east side with its slow patient work against the mortar, building toward a change that was still a season away but was coming regardless. Chapter 4, The Education of Lords. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, which Harry had come to think of as his reading day, no scheduled visits from Ragnarok or Blademark, no legal documents requiring annotation, just the library and whatever he'd decided needed understanding that week. He was deep into a text on ancient magical bloodline theory when the owl landed on the window ledge and tapped the glass with a persistence that suggested it had been instructed not to take no for an answer. The envelope was cream-colored, heavy, and sealed with a wax impression of a vulture. Harry opened it. Mr. Potter, my grandson has spoken of you with the kind of enthusiasm he usually reserves for particularly promising plant specimens. I have made certain inquiries of my own. The results were informative. I will be direct, as I find indirection wastes time that could be better spent on action. I am aware of the Gringotts proceedings. I voted in your favor in the session 3 weeks ago not out of sentiment but because the law was clearly on your side, and voting against clear law is something I refuse to do regardless of political convenience. I should like to meet you. Tuesday at 3 in the afternoon. Longbottom Hall. Bring the goblin lawyer if you prefer, though I imagine you'll want to assess the conversation yourself first. Augusta Longbottom P.S. The wisteria on your east wall needs cutting back before it damages the mortar. Tell your estate manager. Harry read the postscript twice. He liked her already. Longbottom Hall was 40 minutes by the Gringotts car, through country lanes that got progressively narrower and more committed to hedgerows as they went. The house itself was old stone and good bones, the kind of building that had been repaired many times without ever being replaced, each repair done with the specific intention of preserving rather than modernizing. The garden was immaculate in the way that Augusta Longbottom appeared to be immaculate, not fussy, just rigorous. Everything precisely where it was meant to be. Neville met Harry at the gate. "She's in the formal sitting room," he said, with the expression of someone reporting current weather conditions in a region known for volatility. "She's wearing the hat with the vulture, so that's either very good or very serious. Possibly both." "Good," Harry said. The formal sitting room was exactly that, a room that had been arranged to conduct formal things in, with high-backed chairs and a fireplace that was lit despite it being June, and on the mantelpiece a row of framed photographs that Harry clocked in one sweep, Neville's parents, young and laughing. A formal family portrait. A wedding photograph. And one photograph, apart from the others, showing a woman in aura robes standing next to a man Harry recognized from his reading of the genealogical records as Frank Longbottom, both of them looking directly at the camera with the specific expression of people who know their work is dangerous and have made their peace with it. Augusta Longbottom stood when Harry came in. She was tall, angular, and possessed of the vulture hat. She looked at Harry with an assessment that was considerably more direct than Dumbledore's had been, where Dumbledore's gaze had sought something and then adjusted, Augusta's gaze located and catalogued. She was not unkind. She was, as advertised, inflexible. "Sit," she said, with the same tone as Ragnarok, and Harry sat with the same ease he'd sat for Ragnarok. She sat across from him. Neville positioned himself in a chair to the side, slightly back, the body language of someone present but trying not to be a variable. "Tea," Augusta said, and it arrived, poured by itself from a pot on the side table, which Harry appreciated as a demonstration of ambient household magic. "You read the session records," Harry said. "I was there for the session." "You read the pre-session documentation," Harry corrected. "The Gringotts challenge filing. You voted with us before the arguments were made, which means you'd already assessed them." Augusta looked at him with an expression that might have been satisfaction. "Blademark sent me the filing the day before the session. I have known Blademark for 20 years. Harry stored that connection away. "What did you think?" "That it was meticulous. That whoever had prepared it understood not just the technical law but the political landscape of the chamber." She picked up her tea. "You're 6 years old." "The documentation was Blademark's and Ragnarok's work," Harry said. "I contributed the questions that shaped the structure." "What questions?" "Why did he lock the Lordships instead of simply taking the money? What he was afraid I'd be able to do withstanding that I couldn't do without it. And why, specifically, he kept me at Privet Drive rather than placing me with any family in the wizarding world who would have provided a more suitable environment." Augusta was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. From somewhere deeper in the house, there was a distant sound of something being knocked over followed by Neville's muffled apology, though he was sitting right in front of Harry, so apparently Longbottom Hall had other inhabitants or other Nevilles. "A house elf," Augusta said, without looking away from Harry. "Right," Harry said. "Your third question," she said. "The placement at Privet Drive. Do you have an answer?" "A hypothesis," Harry said. "He wanted me in an environment with no magical education, no knowledge of my inheritance, and no access to people who might tell me what I was or what I was owed. The Dursleys were selected specifically because they would never tell me anything. He needed me ignorant and dependent on his narrative when I finally entered the wizarding world." He paused. "At Hogwarts. When he was headmaster. And could shape my understanding of everything from the ground up." Augusta set down her tea. "That is not a hypothesis," she said. "That is a conclusion. The evidence supports it." "Yes," she said. It does. She looked at him for a long moment. My son and daughter-in-law are in St. Mungo's Hospital. They have been there since November 1981. They cannot speak, cannot recognize their family, cannot function independently. They were tortured there by Death Eaters who were, at the time, searching for information about Voldemort's defeat. Her voice was entirely level. It was the most rigidly controlled delivery of devastating information Harry had ever heard. The investigation into the circumstances of their attack was conducted by the DMLE and subsequently referred to the Chief Warlock's office for review of the Death Eater's sentencing. It has remained under Chief Warlock review since 1982. For years, Harry said. Yes. What were they investigating when they were attacked? Augusta looked at him. That is the question, isn't it? She picked up her tea again. They were investigating a discrepancy in the timeline of Voldemort's fall. The official narrative is straightforward: Voldemort attacked the Potters, was defeated by the ancient magic of Lily Potter's sacrifice, fled in diminished form. My son believed the timeline had a gap in it. He was looking into what happened in that gap and who had knowledge of it in advance. The fire was very loud in the silence. And then he was tortured, Harry said. And then he was tortured, Augusta agreed. And the investigation was absorbed into Dumbledore's review process and has not surfaced since. Harry opened his notebook. He wrote two things: November 1981 timeline gap. And then, below it, what happened in the gap and who knew. I can't pursue that yet, he said. The legal proceedings have to complete first. If I go after something that's sensitive before I have full standing, he has grounds to frame it as a personal vendetta rather than a legal action. I'm not asking you to pursue it, Augusta said. I'm telling you because you should know the full picture. And because you asked the right questions. She paused. I am asking you something different. Harry waited. The secondary hearing in 3 weeks, she said. Gryffindor, Slytherin, Black. I can deliver 7 votes beyond my own, if the documentation holds. People who have had reservations about Dumbledore's accumulated authority but lacked a mechanism to act on them. Your case is the mechanism. 7 votes. Harry ran the numbers from the session, 61 to 29 on the Hufflepuff challenge, the largest margin of the day. 7 additional votes didn't change the count, but they changed the shape of the coalition. They signaled that opposition was organized rather than opportunistic. Who? Harry asked. People who would prefer to see the legal case succeed quietly. Who are not interested in the political exposure of being seen to oppose Dumbledore publicly but will vote correctly when the chamber is seated. She met his eyes. Not heroes. Practical people. Practical is often more useful than heroic. Agreed, Harry said. What do you need from me? Nothing dramatic, she said, with the faintest possible shade of something that might have been a smile in a different context. Simply win the secondary hearing. If you do, the votes follow. If you establish precedent there, the financial recovery case will be very difficult for anyone to obstruct, because opposing it publicly means defending what Dumbledore did, and the chamber's appetite for that is diminishing. Harry nodded. He looked at the mantelpiece photograph, Frank and Alice Longbottom in their aura robes, the direct gaze, the made peace. Augusta, he said, using the name deliberately, watching her face for the calibration response. She let it stand, which he noted. When the case concludes, he said. When the Lordships are restored and the financial recovery is complete and Dumbledore's guardianship is formally revoked, I intend to look at the timeline gap. Properly. With standing and resources and Amelia Bones involved if she's willing. Augusta was very still. That is not a promise, Harry said. It's an intention. I'm telling you so you know the full picture. She looked at him for a long time, with an expression that was not soft. Augusta Longbottom's expressions were not built for softness, but that carried something underneath the rigidity that was unmistakably human and unmistakably grieving. I know, she said. I simply wanted someone to say it out loud. From the doorway, Neville said, quietly, there's cake, if anyone wants it. It's Gran's, so it's good. Augusta looked at her grandson. Something in her face changed in the specific way it probably only changed for him. Then bring it through, Neville. He brought it through. It was good. 3 days after the meeting at Longbottom Hall, Ragnarok arrived at Linnet Cottage not with documents but with a woman Harry hadn't met. She was tall, pale, and dressed with the kind of elegant precision that was clearly the result of a lifetime of practice rather than natural inclination. Her face was composed in a way that suggested the composition was effortful rather than native. She sat in the kitchen chair with a posture that said she had been trained to sit in chairs like this and had maintained the training long after the trainers were no longer watching. Narcissa Malfoy. Harry had read about the Malfoy family. He'd read about most of the old wizarding families by now. The genealogy work had expanded outward naturally, one connection leading to another, and the Malfoys were a difficult family to avoid in any comprehensive reading of wizarding political history. Lucius Malfoy had been a Death Eater, had claimed coercion after Voldemort's fall, and was currently a significant donor to both the Ministry and to Dumbledore's various public initiatives. The donation history, which Harry had found in a peripheral financial document, was interesting for what it suggested about the relationship between Lucius's legal troubles and his subsequent generosity. Narcissa was different from what Harry expected, though he wasn't sure what he'd expected. She sat across from him and looked at him with clear grey eyes that were doing the same kind of assessment his were, and for a moment the two of them simply looked at each other in mutual professional recognition. "You know who I am," she said. "Yes," Harry said. "And your instinct is distrust." "My instinct is to reserve judgment pending information," Harry said. "Which isn't distrust. It's method." Something moved in her expression. Not warmth exactly. Narcissa Malfoy didn't do warmth, he suspected, in the same way that granite didn't do warmth, but the mineral was solid and reliable and had its own kind of character. "My husband's position is precarious," she said. "He has obligations that conflict with each other and the conflict has been escalating. I have a son who is 9 years old and I would like him to have a future that is not predetermined by the obligations my husband accepted before that son was born." "Draco," Harry said. He'd read that name too. "Yes." She folded her hands on the table. "I am not approaching you with sentiment. I have no interest in being rescued and I am not offering loyalty out of gratitude. I am proposing a transactional relationship based on aligned interests." "What are your interests?" Harry asked. "Voldemort is not finished," she said. It came out flat and direct, stripped of the euphemism that most of the wizarding world still wrapped around that name. "He was diminished, not destroyed. He will return and when he does he will expect the debt my husband owes him to be honored. I would like my family to be in a position where that debt can be discharged without destroying us." Harry looked at her. "You want a way out." "I want options," she corrected. "Currently my family has none. You are in the process of acquiring legal standing and political power at a rate that is, frankly, unexpected for someone of your age." A pause. "You are also, according to the prophecy," she stopped. Harry sat forward slightly. "What prophecy?" Narcissa looked at Ragnarok, who had been silent since introducing her. Ragnarok's expression was the geological one. He said nothing. "There is a prophecy in the Department of Mysteries," Narcissa said carefully. "Concerning you and Voldemort. I don't know its precise contents. Very few people do. But Lucius has referenced it in the context of Voldemort's plans for your future." She paused. "Dumbledore knows its contents. He has known since before your parents died." Harry was quiet for a moment. He thought about the timeline gap Augusta had mentioned. He thought about what Ragnarok had said about the Emery's inheritance, a person who could operate completely outside the power structure, not dependent on any institution. He thought about a prophecy that involved him, that Dumbledore had known since before his parents died, and about his parents dying when he was 15 months old. He pushed that thought into a specific place in his mind, a holding space, a box with a label that said "Not yet, build first," and looked at Narcissa. "What are you offering?" he said. "Information," she said. "Lucius is in proximity to Voldemort's remaining network in ways that most of the Ministry does not know about. When it becomes relevant, when the return begins, that information will have value." She met his eyes. "In exchange, I want a formal declaration, on Black Lordship grounds, that Draco and I are under House Potter protection. A legal shield that gives us standing independent of Lucius's affiliations." Harry looked at Ragnarok. "Can I do that? With 3 lordships and 2 pending?" "Potter Lordship is sufficient for a formal protection declaration," Ragnarok said. "It has no legal force in criminal proceedings, but it creates a public record of house alignment that makes it significantly harder for Voldemort or his associates to move against the protected party without creating a visible conflict with your house. It's political protection, not physical," Harry said to Narcissa. "I'm aware. I have my own resources for physical." A pause. "This is about position. About making it publicly legible that my family has a legitimate relationship with a rising power that is not Voldemort. It changes the calculus." Harry thought about this carefully. He thought about the 12 million Galleons and what Ragnarok had said about the money being channeled into Dumbledore's network, people who benefited from his arrangement, who would defend him to protect the thing their support had built. He thought about what it meant to build a different kind of network, one based not on dependency and debt but on aligned interests and honest transactions. "The information you're offering," he said. "When it becomes relevant, I need it to be actionable. Not filtered. Not timed to your advantage." "I would expect the same in return," she said. "Unfiltered information is a vulnerability for both parties. That's what makes it a functional exchange." "Agreed," Harry said. He looked at Ragnarok again. "Draw up the protection declaration for House Potter. List Narcissa and Draco Malfoy as protected parties, conditional on good faith information exchange, renewable annually." He looked back at Narcissa. "When do you want to do this?" "Today," she said. "If possible." "Today," Harry agreed. Narcissa looked at him for a moment with an expression that was the closest thing to respect he'd seen from her, which given that they'd been talking for 15 minutes was probably faster than she usually got there. "You're not what the report suggested," she said. "What did the report suggest?" "That you were being held in obscurity by Dumbledore's arrangements and would emerge as either a confused child who could be managed or a poorly trained wildcard." She paused. "He genuinely believed the Privet Drive arrangement would keep you manageable." "He didn't account for Gringotts," Harry said. "No," Narcissa said. "He didn't." Ragnarok produced the documentation. Narcissa signed it with the composed precision of someone who had been signing legal documents since she was a teenager and had never done so carelessly. Harry signed it with the green ink pen. After she left, Ragnarok looked at Harry with an expression that was as close to impressed as his face got. "She came to you," he said. "Yes," Harry said. "She didn't have to. The Malfoy resources are sufficient to manage their situation through other mechanisms." "She came to me," Harry said, "because she's read the situation correctly and she's choosing the right side before she has to rather than after she has to." He looked at the signed document. "Which tells me she's smarter than her husband." "Considerably," Ragnarok agreed. The magic was getting interesting. That was the only word Harry had for it, interesting, the way an equation becomes interesting when the variables start producing unexpected results. The crack in the suppression that had started with the first lordship restoration was widening incrementally with each legal advance, and what was coming through it was not the cautious, minimal thing the suppression had been designed to reduce him to but something that felt native and large and entirely willing. He'd been practicing in the garden after dinner each evening, using the wild space along the back wall where nobody could see from the lane. The wandless work had started with small objects and was progressing steadily, not because Harry was pushing it, but because the magic itself seemed to understand what it was trying to do and the practice was simply about learning to stay out of its way. He could move objects reliably up to about 20 feet now, and the weight limit was increasing. He'd levitated the stone bench on Thursday evening, which had surprised him. He'd aimed for a rock near the bench and hit the wrong target, and the bench had risen 3 feet before he'd set it down carefully, his heart going quickly with something that was adjacent to exhilaration. He'd tried it deliberately the next evening and gotten 6 feet before his focus slipped. Ripclaw watched these sessions from the kitchen window with an expression of professional interest. The suppression is at roughly 40% integrity, she told him one evening when he came in. She was checking her ward instruments at the kitchen table. When Ragnarok filed the first challenge, it was at 90. Each restored lordship drops it further. When all 8 are restored, it will be gone entirely. What happens to the magic then? Harry asked. I don't know, she said honestly. No Emery's practitioner has had their inheritances suppressed and then restored before. It's not a documented scenario. She paused. But based on the trajectory of what I'm seeing in the wards respond to the ambient magic in the protected space, I would say it will be significant. Significant like how? She looked at him over her instruments. The wards at Linnet Cottage are calibrated for a standard magical household. They are currently running at 240% of their design capacity. Harry sat down. That's from me, he said. That's from you, she said. And that's at 40% suppression. She looked at her instruments again with the thoughtful expression of someone doing math that they find both informative and slightly alarming. You should be careful. Not of the power, don't misunderstand me, I'm not suggesting you constrain it. But you should be aware of the environment. Glass near you will be fragile when you're emotional. Electronics won't work, though that's less relevant here than it would have been at Privet Drive. Candles will flare. She paused. Don't be in an argument near anything irreplaceable. Harry thought about this. What about people, he said. Can it affect people? It doesn't work like that, Ripclaw said. The Emery's magic in the historical records was described as sovereign, it affects the world, not other people's will or awareness. It's not mind magic. It's closer to what Muggles might call physics. You move things, change states, alter the physical properties of matter. She closed her instrument case. The Slytherin inheritance is where the mind magic sits, and that one's still suppressed. What does the Slytherin mind magic actually do? She considered her answer for a long time. Think of it as perceptual clarity, she said finally. An ability to understand what's true about a person or a situation without relying on what they're telling you. Not reading minds, more like reading context. Intent. The emotional texture of a conversation. She paused. You probably already do this to some extent. It runs in the bloodline regardless of the suppression. Harry thought about Dumbledore in the corridor after the hearing, the warmth that he could feel the structure of without being affected by it. He thought about reading Narcissa's composed face and finding the specific note of genuine fear beneath the professionalism. He thought about 6 years of reading Vernon and Petunia's moods from small signals, the particular quality of Vernon's silence before a difficult evening, the angle of Petunia's spine when she was suppressing something she didn't want to perform. He'd thought that was just survival. Paying attention because you had to. Maybe it was that, and also something else. The week before the secondary hearing, Harry did something he'd been thinking about since the first session. He wrote a letter. Not to Dumbledore, that would be premature and would give away information he wasn't ready to give. Not to any political figure or legal contact. He wrote to Amelia Bones at the DMLE, addressed formally and precisely, referencing her presence at the Wisingamot session and her public request for the Sirius Black detention records. The letter contained 3 things, a polite introduction, a notation that Gringotts was including the black suppression instrument in the secondary hearing documentation, and, this was the careful part, the part he spent 4 drafts getting right, a single question. Has the DMLE conducted any independent review of the evidence presented at the time of Sirius Black's initial detention, or only of the extension authorization records? He didn't allege anything. He didn't state conclusions. He asked one clean question, the answer to which he suspected he already knew, and left it to Amelia Bones to understand what the question was actually pointing at. Ripclaw sent it by official Gringotts owl, which gave it a provenance that meant it would be taken seriously and handled carefully. The reply came in 2 days. Mr. Potter, no independent review of the original evidence has been conducted. The initial detention was processed without documentation of trial proceedings, which is an anomaly that the DMLE has been attempting to address through official channels. I appreciate the question. Amelia Bones, Director, DMLE Short. Precise. No wasted words. Harry liked her very much. He wrote back the same day, Director Bones, Gringotts has in its treaty records a copy of the original detention authorization, which was submitted to us as part of the guardianship instrument processing in November 1981. We are prepared to make this available to the DMLE under Treaty Article 9 if formally requested. Harry Potter. The response this time came within hours, by Ministry Owl rather than Standard Post, which indicated that someone at the DMLE had moved quickly after reading it. Please submit the documentation at the earliest opportunity. A.B. Harry folded both letters and put them with the session documents in the case file Ragnarok had established. He sat for a moment in the library with the afternoon sun coming through the window and thought about the shape of what was assembling. 3 weeks ago he had been a 6-year-old with a pillowcase and a notebook. Now he had 3 lordships, a goblin legal team, an aligned vote block in the Wizengamot, a protection arrangement with a Malfoy, an open DMLE correspondence, and approximately 12 hours before the secondary hearing at which he would recover 3 more inheritances. He thought about Dumbledore's letter to Gringotts, warmly concerned, impeccably polite, and about the face in the corridor afterward, the genuine reassessment. The model failing to predict the data. He wondered what the model looked like now. How much of it had been revised? Whether Dumbledore had yet understood that the architecture of the arrangement, the careful, patient, insulated structure of it, had been built to protect against a different kind of challenge than the one Harry was making. The structure was built to deflect a frontal attack. A hero charging in with accusations and righteous anger, easy to frame as unstable and misguided. Harry wasn't charging. He was filing documents, asking precise questions, building coalitions through aligned interest rather than sentiment, and letting the legal record speak in the flat, unambiguous voice of documented evidence. He got up and went to the kitchen to help Ripclaw with dinner, moving 3 ingredients from across the kitchen to the counter without touching them, and went back to thinking about the secondary hearing while he chopped onions. The candles on the table flared once, briefly, and settled. Neville came by that evening, as he often did on the days before something significant, not to discuss the something significant but to be present in the general vicinity of it, which Harry had come to understand was a specifically Neville Longbottom expression of solidarity. He brought a cutting from something he'd been growing at home. Mimbulus Mimbletonia, he said, setting it on the kitchen table with the reverence of someone presenting a significant gift. It was, objectively speaking, a very strange-looking plant, grayish-green, covered in nodules, pulsing very faintly in a way that was either deeply unsettling or fascinating depending on your relationship with unusual plants. It's rare. Gran found the seed for me last birthday. I thought you should have a cutting for the cottage. Harry looked at it. It pulsed. He looked at Neville. It defends itself by emitting stink sap when threatened, Neville said, with the enthusiasm of someone describing a particularly compelling feature. You have to be careful with it near the fireplace. I'll keep that in mind, Harry said. I also, Neville paused, with the expression of someone who has prepared to say something and has arrived at the saying it part and finds it slightly more exposed than the preparing it part had suggested. I know you have the hearing tomorrow. And I know it's your thing, yours and Ragnarok's and Blademark's. I'm not trying to, I just thought. He stopped. Started again. Gran told me the whole of it last week. She sat me down and explained everything. The money and the Lordships and the Dursleys and all of it. Harry waited. I think what was done to you is one of the worst things I've ever heard of, Neville said, with a directness that was clearly Augusta's influence delivered through Neville's own particular emotional register. "And I think you're handling it the right way. And I just wanted to say that. Before tomorrow." Harry looked at him. 6 years old was a strange age to be navigating any of this, but it was the age they both were, and the conversation was happening with a naturalness that felt entirely correct. "Thank you," Harry said. He meant it without qualification. Neville nodded. He looked at the Mimbulus Mimbletonia. "Also, it'll keep pests off the east wall. The wisteria patch. It emits something the beetles don't like." "Dual purpose," Harry said. "Gran says everything useful should be," Neville said. They ate dinner. Ripclaw had made something with the herbs from the garden that was considerably better than anything available at Privet Drive, and Neville talked about root systems and Harry talked about Wisengamot procedure, and somewhere in the middle of it, without announcement or ceremony, they became the kind of friends who can sit in a kitchen in the evening and talk about completely different things and have it feel like a conversation. At 8 o'clock Neville stood to go and said, at the door, "Good luck tomorrow. Not that you need it, I think. But still. It doesn't hurt," Harry said. After he left, Harry sat at the kitchen table for a long time, the Mimbulus Mimbletonia pulsing gently beside the salt cellar, and wrote the last entry in his notebook before the secondary hearing. "What I have, 3 lordships. 7 votes from Augusta's block. DMLE correspondence established. Protection arrangement with Narcissa Malfoy. Ragnarok, Sharp Claw, Blade Mark. Rip Claw. Neville." He looked at that last word. Then looked at the whole list. "What Dumbledore has, everything he built with my money, and 5 fewer years to use it in." He closed the notebook. The fire was low and the cottage was warm, and outside the wild garden was dark, and the wisteria held its slow patient position against the east wall, and tomorrow the secondary hearing would begin, and somewhere in London in a ministry office the serious black detention records were making their way through a chain of official hands toward a woman who had been waiting for them for 8 months and would know exactly what to do with them. Harry blew out the kitchen candle without touching it, and went to bed. Chapter 5, Blood and Precedent. The secondary hearing had none of the ceremonial uncertainty of the first. The first session had been a revelation, for the chamber, for Dumbledore, possibly for itself. People had come in expecting a procedural irregularity and encountered something with architecture and intention and a 6-year-old at the center of it who looked at the chief warlock like he was reading him. That session had the quality of a door being opened. This one had the quality of people walking through it. Harry arrived 40 minutes early, which gave him time to watch the chamber fill. He sat in the visitor section with his notebook open and catalogued the arrivals the way Ripclaw catalogued the ward instruments, systematically, noting position, noting the small physical tells of people who were calibrating their public alignment in real time. Who sat next to whom? Who avoided eye contact with whom? Who found reasons to cross the central floor and exchange quiet words before taking their seats? Augusta Longbottom arrived precisely on time, took her seat without speaking to anyone, and sat with the vulture hat and the ramrod spine and the specific stillness of someone who had already decided everything they needed to decide and was simply waiting for the proceedings to confirm it. Amelia Bones arrived 2 minutes later, and she was carrying a folder that was considerably thicker than anything she'd carried to the first session. Harry looked at that folder. He'd sent the Gringotts copy of the original black detention authorization to her office 3 days ago. He had a reasonable idea of what was in the folder, which meant he had a reasonable idea of what today was going to become, and it was going to become considerably more than a hearing about 3 lordship restorations. He wrote in his notebook, "Today is not one thing. It's 3 things at once." Blade Mark sat beside him. "You've seen the Bones folder," she said, without looking at him. "Yes. It changes the shape of the day." "It was always going to be today," Harry said. "The timing isn't accidental. She's been waiting for the documentation and the documentation arrived 3 days ago and she's here with it now. She chose this session deliberately." "She did," Blade Mark said. "I spoke with her yesterday evening." Harry looked at her. "You coordinated." Aligned interests, Blademark said, with a professional neutrality that was entirely unconvincing as a denial. The Black Challenge and the detention issue are legally connected through the suppression instrument. It made sense to address them in sequence. Harry almost smiled. Good, he said. Dumbledore arrived last, which was probably intentional. The chief warlock arriving after the chamber was seated was a demonstration of the ease of authority, the confidence of someone who knows the room will wait. He walked to the elevated chair with the same unhurried grace as the first session, robes moving with that particular quality of expensive fabric held by someone who has forgotten it's expensive. He looked at Harry when he sat down. Harry was already looking at him. The warmth was there, fully deployed. But behind it, and Harry was increasingly certain this was the Slytherin inheritance doing its partial, suppressed work, reading the emotional texture of a room, there was something that hadn't been present at the first session. It wasn't fear. Dumbledore wasn't afraid of Harry, not yet. It was something more like the feeling of standing on ground that has been reliable for decades and noticing, for the first time, that it has a slight give to it. The chamber will come to order, Dumbledore said. His voice did what it always did, filled the room, settled it, made it smaller and more intimate. The business before this session continues the inheritance challenge proceedings initiated 3 weeks ago by Gringotts Bank on behalf of the minor heir Harrison James Potter. We will hear the Gryffindor and Slytherin challenges first, followed by the Black Challenge, and then open the floor for any connected matters the chamber wishes to raise. A pause so natural it seemed unplanned. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the gravity of these proceedings. Whatever their outcome, they represent a serious examination of institutional practice, and I believe this chamber should approach them with the seriousness they deserve. It was a perfectly constructed statement. It framed him as the adult in the room. It suggested he welcomed scrutiny. It positioned whatever concessions he made as his own principled choices rather than legal necessities. Harry wrote, he's framing the concessions before they happen. Wants to own them. The Gryffindor challenge consumed the first 2 hours. Blademark had spent the 3 weeks since the first session building a documentation chain for the conquest inheritance mechanism that was, by any objective measure, bulletproof. She had goblin historical records from 1347 citing the Potter acquisition of the Gryffindor seat, cross-referenced with 3 independent genealogical registries, supported by a letter of blood confirmation signed by Ragnarok himself attesting to the current verification of the bloodline connection. She had the 1612 precedent, the 1743 precedent, and a 1891 ministry ruling that had been largely forgotten but which established, in explicit language, that conquest inheritance titles recognized in Goblin treaty records superseded ministry jurisdiction claims. Crouch fought it. He was good, Harry gave him that, filing countermotions with the quick mechanical efficiency of someone who had clearly spent the 3 weeks preparing. But the documentation was too complete. Every motion he filed was met by a page in Blademark's folder that had specifically anticipated it, and the effect, as the morning wore on, was of a man running out of room in a progressively smaller space. At 10:47, Dumbledore called a brief recess. Harry used the 15 minutes to eat half a sandwich and watch the chamber's social patterns. Augusta was speaking quietly with 2 members Harry identified as Griselda Marchbanks and Tiberius Ogden, both old-line families, both with the specific kind of conservative legal sensibility that cared more about procedure than politics. Which meant Augusta's conversation with them was probably about procedure. Smart. When the chamber resumed, Marchbanks raised a point of order before Crouch could file the next countermotion. The chain of precedent presented by Gringotts is internally consistent, she said, in the dry, precise tones of someone who had spent a career examining consistency. The counter-arguments raised by the ministry barrister address peripheral points without engaging the central chain. I move that this chamber accept the Gryffindor challenge documentation as sufficient and proceed to a vote. Seconded, said Ogden. The vote was 74-16. Gryffindor restored. Harry wrote the number in his notebook, circled it, and moved on. The Slytherin challenge ran faster, because Blademark had structured the documentation to piggyback on the Gryffindor precedent. if the conquest inheritance mechanism was valid for Gryffindor, the same mechanism applied to Slytherin, the bloodline evidence was at least as strong, and the suppression instrument had the identical technical defect. Crouch tried to argue that the Slytherin inheritance represented a special case given its historical associations with dark magic, which was the weakest argument he'd made all day, and produced an audible murmur in the chamber that suggested the room's patience for this line of attack was exhausted. Amelia Bones said, from the far right, without raising her voice, "I'd like to remind the chamber that the legal question before us is the validity of a suppression instrument, not an assessment of the heir's character or the historical reputation of a family name." The vote was 71 to 19. Slytherin restored. 5 out of 8, and the remaining 3, Black, Ravenclaw, Emrys, were in secondary proceedings at a later date with the documentation well advanced. Harry sat with 5 for a moment. Felt the weight of it. Then Blademark opened the black folder and the day changed shape. The black challenge, Blademark said, is connected to the suppression instrument via the proxy authorization, as in the previous cases. However, the black challenge has an additional dimension that this chamber should address directly. She placed a document on the table. The suppression of the Black Lordship inheritance was filed as part of the same instrument batch as the others in early 1982. At the time, Sirius Black, the primary Black heir, and Harry Potter's designated godfather under the Potter family will, was already in custody at Azkaban. She paused there. The pause was deliberate, the way a pause in a piece of music is deliberate. The silence tells you something about what comes next. Sirius Black was detained in November 1981 without trial, she continued. This is documented. What has not been examined in this chamber is the legal basis for his detention beyond the initial 6-month temporary authorization. She produced 3 more documents. Gringotts, in its review of the guardianship instruments attached to the Potter estate, obtained copies of the detention extension orders from our treaty record archives. These were submitted to our legal registry in November 1981 as part of the broader Potter estate administration documentation. A pause. They bear the signature of the chief warlock. The room went quiet. Not the heavy silence of complexity or the murmur precursor silence of surprise. A different quality entirely, the silence of a room where people are actively not looking at each other because looking at each other would require acknowledging something they'd been not quite knowing for years. The extension orders, Blademark continued, her voice maintaining the same surgical precision it had carried all day, authorized Sirius Black's detention without trial beyond the statutory limit on the grounds of an ongoing investigation. The investigation referenced in the orders was described as related to active Death Eater networks. She set the last document on the table. The investigation in question was closed by the Ministry in March 1982. The extension orders were not revisited. Sirius Black has remained in Azkaban for 5 years on the authority of orders referencing an investigation that concluded 4 years and 8 months ago. She sat down. The silence continued for a moment, and then it broke all at once, not in the murmurant subside pattern of the earlier debates but in a genuine fracture of the chamber's composure, multiple voices at once, some demanding clarification, some demanding the documentation be reviewed, and from the far right, cutting through all of it, Amelia Bones, who was on her feet. The DMLE received documentation from Gringotts 3 days ago, she said. I have completed a preliminary review. She held up her folder, the thick one Harry had noted on arrival. The original detention authorization for Sirius Black contains procedural irregularities that the DMLE has not previously been aware of because the original records were flagged under Chief Warlock review and have not been accessible to my department for 8 months, despite 4 formal requests. She looked at Dumbledore. Not with hostility, with the specific expression of someone who has been a law enforcement professional for 30 years and is in the presence of something their professional self cannot overlook. I am formally requesting that this chamber authorize an immediate independent review of the Sirius Black detention under DMLE mandate. Dumbledore looked at Amelia Bones. For the first time all day, across both sessions, 6 weeks of proceedings, Harry saw something in the Chief Warlock's expression that was unambiguously not what it was pretending to be. The warmth was there. The serenity was there. But underneath them, visible for perhaps 3 seconds before the control reasserted itself, was the expression of a man standing on ground that has just moved significantly under his feet and is recalculating whether it will hold. 3 seconds. Harry burned it into memory. The Chief Warlock will not oppose such a review, Dumbledore said. His voice was exactly the same. The expression was back to serene. But it was the second time in 6 weeks he'd been forced to retreat by framing the retreat as his own choice, and the chamber was watching, and the chamber had memory. I second the motion, Augusta said, before anyone else could speak. The vote for independent DMLE review was 81 to 9. 9. Harry counted the 9. Filed them. The formal vote on the Black Suppression Challenge came after the authorization of the DMLE review, and passed 77 to 13, and afterward the chamber sat with a slightly stunned quality, the way a room feels after something significant has happened too quickly for the processing to catch up. Blademark leaned to Harry. 6, she said quietly. I know, Harry said. The Ravenclaw and Emery's challenges are scheduled for the session after next. The documentation is ready. She paused. The financial recovery case can be formally filed immediately after the 6th restoration. File it the same day, Harry said. I had planned to, she said. Harry looked at the chamber. Augusta was back in her composed stillness. Amelia Bones was speaking rapidly to an aide, the thick folder open on her lap. Fudge was doing the political equivalent of a man checking which way the wind was blowing before deciding which direction to stand facing. Various other members were engaged in the rapid quiet recalculations of people whose positions had just become slightly less comfortable. And Dumbledore was sitting in the Chief Warlock's chair, listening to a report from Crouch, his expression perfectly maintained, his hands folded on the table before him with the patience of someone who has seen a great many things and is confident in his ability to navigate through this one as he has navigated through all the others. Harry watched him for a moment. Then looked away. He understood something that he'd been building toward for 6 weeks of legal proceedings, and he understood it with a clarity that felt almost physical. Dumbledore was not going to break. Not legally, he had too many ins more actions Claude Sonnet 4.